Hi, this is Tucker Goodrich. I have the pleasure today to be joined by Jacob Hands, who is at the George Washington University School of Medicine down in Washington, D.C. Jacob, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Tucker. Pleasure to be here.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I really don't know much about you or your background, except for our interactions on the site formerly known as Twitter. But you were kind enough to send me a copy of a paper that you recently studied, which I found to be pretty fascinating. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing down at George Washington.
Sure. So, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Right now at GW, I'm a medical student. So, I'm in the course of getting a degree there, which hopefully should wrap up next couple of years, but we'll see.
And
Um,
what are you getting a degree in?
oh,
Or
it's
what's your
it's
plan?
oh, it's an MD. So
Okay,
it's the School of Medicine and Health Sciences. So that is like my day job, if you will.
right.
The interesting stuff is on the side. I consult for consumer labs. So
Okay.
consumerlab.com is an online independent testing company, if your listeners aren't aware. They test everything from fish oil supplements, dark chocolate, walnuts. And so I work kind of more on the academic side of that with the director of research, where we kind of in detail go over the fine aspects of fish oil and the fatty acids therein contained. Then
Okay.
I also contract
Hence,
research.
hence the paper that they're
Yes,
co-authors on the paper that we're here to discuss today.
exactly. Yeah. So those are my co-authors, and I guess we'd call them my project bosses or my project leaders on this. So they're the PIs. And then in addition to that, I do contract research for Found My Fitness, which is run by Rhonda Patrick and her husband
Yep.
Dan. Great team there. And then I work with Lee Frame, who is one of the directors of nutrition and has so many roles at GW, but she's done a lot of great work. So I do a lot of work in vitamin D metabolism and also a little bit of work in dark chocolate and heavy metal.
Cool. All
Yeah,
fun topics.
always so fun.
Dark chocolate and heavy metal. You're not going to ruin dark chocolate for us, are you? I hope.
No, I'll try not to. I think
Okay.
there's like a lot of weird opinions on that, but I'm happy to kind of get into it. But also, just as a disclaimer, any opinion that I express in this is just kind of my own opinion, does not reflect that of my bosses or my employers or anybody else. And I am always liable to be incorrect. So I love being corrected if you or any of your listeners know something better.
That's great. Okay. So omega 3s, you wrote a paper looking at oxidation rates in omega 3 supplements, fish oil supplements,
Mhm.
and looking also at the effects of long-term consumption of these supplements. And I found this fascinating. There is some evidence out there that uh, oxidized omega-3 fats can be harmful. There are some
Mhm.
animal models that have shown that. Ray Peat, who is may he rest in peace, a very interesting man who did a lot of somewhat eclectic nutrition research, let's call it that way, but also was very good about documenting his opinions, made a
Yeah.
claim that, or showed some, referenced some papers that showed that high consumption of alcohol in the presence of high amounts of fish oil could be very toxic to organisms, which is an interesting finding. And I've always said to people, yes, it's probably a good idea based on that if you're eating a lot of fish, not to drink a lot of alcohol. But then again,
Fascinating.
it's always a good idea not to drink a lot of alcohol. So,
Fair. Yeah, that's very
it's
fair.
not a super great guideline to go by. And, there are some other animal models that we can go into later. But on the flip side of that is I'm not aware of any population level evidence or anywhere showing that a population with a high consumption of fish has a negative health outcome.
No,
Or
no, that's correct.
right, okay. So somewhere in there is probably just because too much of everything, too much water, too much oxygen is bad for you. So somewhere in there, there's probably a line where too much. I mean, to that point, the Inuit, the Eskimo populations, have a genetic mutation, which we don't really need to go into the details of which here, but some people have speculated it's to protect them from excess consumption of omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. And that
It's
could be an interesting marker pointing at harm And I think they probably have the highest consumption of omega-3 polyunsaturated fats of any population that we know of. So, so help us figure out where the line is, if it's possible at this point in our understanding. Tell us a little bit about your paper and what you were looking at.
Sure. So just as a broad overview, consumer labs every few years or every couple years, and I don't want to speak out of turn for them, they'll test a batch of fish oil supplements. And these will be the most common supplements that are identified out of like a 10 to 8,000 person survey, depending on the year. And these are the ones consumers take most. It's usually a pretty savvy population. So these are not kind of like, generally speaking, cheap oils. These are just like the popular ones that people have trust in, USP certified, IFOS, many of them. So
What's
they're
USP?
USP is United States Pharmacopoeia. It's essentially a way of doing things from a medical or pharmaceutical standpoint. But the point is that oftentimes people say, look for USP or look for IFOS, which is the International Fish Oil Organization. But essentially,
so they're certification agencies.
Yeah. So IFOS
quality control.
Yeah, IFOS does do certification. It's not really certification; they go by stars. And so essentially, you could have like this perfect star rating on IFOS, which corresponds to low oxidation, low PCBs, which we can get into, and a number of other factors. That is run by the Global Organization for EPA and DHA Oils, GOED. We could again go into GOED and how they function. Essentially, there is no mandated rule for oxidation in a fish oil supplement. There is no rule that specifies how much EPA or DHA has to contain. It is a free-for-all. And so essentially, USP and IFOS are just kind of, for the consumer, joint ways to identify a high versus low quality product. And so the point being, most of the fish oils that we tested, or the fish oil supplements, they should be probably more appropriately classified as omega-3 because we include algae, krill, et cetera, generally to those categories. And so is kind of a background to this. There's this interesting observation that populations that eat a lot of fish have lower rates of all-cause mortality. So it's just a fact that if you go to Japan, you start testing out populations that eat a lot of fish. They live longer, and that holds for a lot of different things. Mediterranean diet, high in omega-3, high in fish. Most of these major diets that you see, most of these major populations that you do research on, fish consumption is positively associated with outcomes, cardiovascular, cognitive, atherogenic, you name it, it's beneficial. So then this becomes this interesting question of, if that is true, why is it that when we do these broad reviews, like Cochrane style reviews with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people at this point, of fish oil, are there inconsistent results? In other words, it is inconsistent that fish oil protects you from coronary heart disease. It's just not reliable that any of these things actually take place when you, from a supplement, increase your serum levels of EPA and DHA, even though you have randomized control trials showing that effectively high. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've heard some people say that those results have varied over time, that the earlier studies tended to show more benefit than some of the recent studies. And I've heard some speculation around why that might be the case. But if you have any, just an observation, if you haven't heard that, then let's keep on with your
Yeah, that's fine. I would like to explore that further. I mean, I have also seen a suggestion of that. I don't exactly know the reason. I mean, if anything, to be honest with you, the trend is towards lower oxidation and lower contamination. So
in fish oils.
Yes, in fish oil. So not too long ago, and I hate to belabor. So a lot of what we're going to talk about is biochemical and its processing. So it can get a touch heavy. So I will try to keep this as light as possible. But the way that fish oil is extracted and how it's extracted is really from small populations of fish, generally speaking, when you're talking about omega-3 fish oil. So you have mackerel, sardines, just kind of these tiny bait fish. Now, the reason that those fish were used primarily is because they didn't have a lot of mercury. So essentially, you get small bait fish. And the reason why you had small bait fish is mercury was the limiting agent. Again, I could go into why mercury was the limiting agent.
I think most people are generally familiar with that. Toxins concentrate up the food chain. Mercury is a concentration, a toxin. So if you're at the top of the food chain, you're going to get the maximal dose of mercury after all the little critters have eaten it first, right? So exactly, eat the little critters, you avoid the doses. Same thing holds for PCBs and any other ubiquitous environmental contaminants.
Yeah, that's entirely correct. So essentially, you had this weird limiting agent, which is that we need to get these fish oils, but there's this problem of mercury, and there's also this problem of saturated fat, which most people do not understand. When you buy a fish oil supplement, that fish oil supplement is the majority, if it's a good quality supplement, EPA and DHA. But for a long time, that wasn't always the case. It would maybe be 30% EPA, DHA, 40%. And only now are you getting to see in the range of 80% omega-3, but specifically EPA, DHA concentrations. They're diluted by DPA, but also saturated fats, palmitic, oleic. You know, it's a complex. A fish is a complex biological organism like we are, and so you get different fatty acid mosaics that comprise it. And so the history of fish oil is that as you go forward in time, you get molecular CO2-based distillation that is really, really good at refining out the contaminants like PCB and mercury, and then slowly distilling the actual omega, EPA, and DHA in these concentrated capsules. And so that really has been the art of fish oil, and that is largely why the industry has gotten better as a general rule with respect to their oxidation.
Well, that's good to hear, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and so listen, there's still problems contained in that. And so what we sort of did in the study is examine about 72 omega-3 supplements, most of them again fish oil, but we included algae and I think one or two krill oil.
Which are just alternative sources of EPA and DHA.
Yeah. So again, I will try my best to not go on any tangents because you ask great questions and these are all very interesting things. So when you talk about like, is krill oil the same as EPA and DHA that you get from a regular fish? This is a complicated question. It's generally speaking in phospholipid form. And so you're going to have different people arguing about the incorporation rate into a red blood cell. The reason why they talk about that is that's how you measure it, right? So if you're Bill Harris and you run Omega Quant, Dr. Bill Harris is, of course, one of the most famous omega-3 guys around. He also did a lot of fatty acid research, amazing researcher. The point being,
somebody Rhonda Patrick has been doing a lot of work with lately.
Yes, she has, and rightly so. That man is an expert. If there's anything that is off kilter, he will gladly correct it in this podcast. But point being, you incorporate into that RBC membrane. That RBC membrane roughly corresponds to other tissues in the body, heart, lungs, etc. So it's a reliable marker that when you look at that red blood cell and you analyze the EPA and DHA content, you will then talk about incorporation. Point being, there may be some differences with krill. It is very complicated. It's neither here nor there at this moment.
Okay, so, yeah, I mean, getting into phospholipids versus triglycerides is definitely getting way down into the weeds. Just one question. So, how is Consumer Labs funding this research? You said they do this every few years. Is the industry paying them to do this? Do they do this as a loss leader so that they get more visibility in the marketplace? What's their motivation?
Yeah, they're completely independent. So I just want to be clear. They're completely independent of any financial ties outside of their members. Their members pay a yearly fee to allow them access to these reports. But it's completely independent. So they have no one that is telling them what to test or how to test it, et cetera. So I really want to stress that. And that's, kind of the magic of it. If they're curious, go to consumerlab.com. They'll provide a lot of information on the methodology of it.
Okay, but, great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And so kind of moving into this, when you look at omega-3s over the course of I think the original date was 2010 or 2012. We'll have to look at the paper up until 2020, I want to say. You find some interesting things. One of them is that a really good percentage of the supplements that we tested were above the total oxidation threshold of 26. And so whenever you're ready, Tucker, I can briefly explain why Totox is relevant and what comprises Totox.
I think you'd better.
Yeah. So when someone gets a fish oil supplement and they want to know whether or not it's rancid and you send it to a laboratory, you get an output called Totox or total oxidation. So it's kind of funny because Totox isn't actually a laboratory measurement. It is an amalgamation of two different measures. That is the peroxide value, or PV, which is less than or equal to 5 milliequivalents per kilogram of O2. And then something called the para-anisidine value, or PAV, which is supposed to be less than or equal to 20. And so 2 times that peroxide value plus the anisidine value is what will deliver a Totox. That Totox is less than or equal to 26. Does that make sense?
Right. And what's the 26 cutoff? Is that just
26 is the maximal limit that GOED stipulates is considered acceptable. So we talk about acceptable limits. That is the acceptable limit.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. And so what essentially we found is that a good portion of the flavored supplements in particular exceeded the Totox of 26 oxidative threshold. And so I would like to first preface me saying that with a flavored oil is going to have things like citrus or vanilla added flavors. So a lot of companies started adding that for fishy burps because the consumer says, hey, I took a fish oil, my fish oil is tasting funny. I don't like tasting rancid fish. I'm going to add in this flavor. And so that started this whole controversy where it was kind of a question of, are they adding these oils because they're giving you rancid oil and they're trying to mask it? Or is the oil just kind of a pleasant thing for when the consumer is eating the supplement to kind of mask any unpleasant effects associated with the fish oil? Complicated. The other issue therein contained is that a flavored oil, by virtue of the fact that it's aromatic, has aldehydes in it. The aldehyde interferes with the testing of that second part of the Totox measurement, or para-anisidine value. So a PAV is basically a shift-based type reaction, but can also be colorimetric. The point being is that an aldehyde in the flavor is going to interfere with that measurement because PAV cannot, or by the way, I switch between PAV and AV, it's the same thing. PV, not PAV, is a completely different metric. So PAV, or anisidine value, cannot distinguish where that aldehyde is coming from. It only knows that there's an aldehyde there.
And let's just for the audience. So yes, when you're looking at polyunsaturated fats and you're worried about oxidation, what you're worried about is the fat oxidizing into these various aldehydes. And some of them can be very toxic, some of them can be less toxic. Some of them are actually used as flavorings in the food industry, just to make things maximally confusing. So what Jacob is talking about here is you may take one of these flavorings that could be a degradation product of a polyunsaturated fat, and you're adding it back in, right? So you can't tell if that's the flavoring or from the breakdown process that you're trying to measure in the first place.
Yes, that is entirely correct. And thank you for the summary. More to the point, and I'm sorry because this is a torturous process if you're new to it. But the other problem is that it's very sensitive to the fatty composition also of the oil. So salmon oil notoriously interferes as well with PAV. And to make matters worse, so does phospholipid. So if you have a phospholipid type metal or a fish oil that's polarizing, like a krill oil, that's also going to falsely elevate that level and therefore falsely elevate Totox. And so what you really have is a lot of studies prior that have looked at a lot of fish oil supplements and flatly declared, oh my God, everything is rancid. This is a huge issue. So what we were curious in is not just is the flavored supplement more likely to exceed Totox? Because frankly, we would expect that it would. It's likely that it will exceed Totox, but what percentage will? And more importantly, will the peroxide value change? And is the peroxide value significantly different between a flavored and an unflavored fish oil? And to explain why that matters, as fish oil metabolizes, like you said, it first goes to a peroxide or a hydroperoxide. It then, from that hydroperoxide, will break down into an aldehyde in the form of an alkane or alkane diol, traditionally. And we could talk about what that means. Doesn't really matter for the purposes of this. Point being, peroxide is the primary oxidation product. Anisidine is the secondary oxidation product in the form of an aldehyde. Okay, and you have this weird teeter-totter back and forth, whereas peroxide goes down, aldehyde goes up. But over time, peroxide can actually go back up. So it's a very weird trading phenomena that happens. And thus, to understand oxidation, you must understand the primary oxidation product, which is a peroxide, and the secondary product, which is an aldehyde.
That's a wonderful explanation. Thank you.
My pleasure. So now this is the crazy part. So first of all, 68% of flavored supplements were exceeding that Totox value, but that means that 32% were still within the upper limits of GOED. And in other words, less than or equal to 26. So that's interesting because what that means is that there must be some reliable way by which a fish oil, even if flavored, can still maintain oxidative freshness. So I don't exactly know why that was. Some people say that certain flavorings alter more than others, like the lemon citrus.
I mean, I know that they use a standard way to oxidize polyunsaturated fats is citric acid plus iron.
Yes.
So any sort of, if you're adding citric acid to a fish oil and there's any sort of metal contamination, I would expect that that could oxidize the fish oil and, result in higher oxidation measures. That
No
wouldn't be
doubt.
surprising. And, I don't know about vanilla flavor, or what the effect
It's
would be,
vanilla.
but
It's
vanilla,
vanilla.
yeah, yeah. I don't know if that would have, I don't know what the effect of that might be on the fish oil, but it's
Yeah,
another
and
interesting variable.
there's these weird properties, like when you have astaxanthin, for instance, that also alters it, and that has a whole thing. So it's unclear really as to what's going on, and so maybe there's something intrinsic to the supplement. I don't actually know,
Right.
but the point being is that you say, okay, it exceeded this arbitrary oxidation threshold that we just talked about. That's fine, but is that an artifact? And so there's this big question of like artifactual, like what actually matters. So what we said is, okay, well, instead of looking at the totox, let's look at that primary oxidation product or the peroxide value. Does that peroxide value differ? Because if it did, then what we would say is that there are lower quality oil in a flavored supplement. What was fascinating, I don't, we can go into how it was statistically derived because I know some people care about that. But point being, there was a significant less than 0.05 difference in the peroxide value between a flavored and an unflavored fish oil supplement. In other words, the primary oxidation product, or the measure of primary oxidation, was higher in a flavored oil. Now, that is a striking finding and quite interesting.
Okay, so let's talk for a moment about the totox. Typically, when they're coming up with a standard for toxicity in a product, and that's ultimately what they're getting at with this,
Yes.
you're going to say it's bad at this level, and we're going to set the standard at this level. So if totox at 26 is their arbitrary, I'm presuming in some extent, cutoff, what's a level where you would actually expect to see human toxicity? I mean, so if, for instance, if you don't like the taste of fish oil and you think it's beneficial for you to take it nevertheless, and you prefer the flavored ones, and your totox is, say, 32, is that worth worrying about? Or is it, the harmful totox is 300, so 32 versus 26 isn't going to really make a difference to your health status?
Yeah, so you ask actually a question that was never really well answered. So
Oh,
there was
drat.
so there was at least to my knowledge, and listen, like PubMed is a vast array of encyclopedic things. Maybe somebody has done something. So the major trial is by a gentleman named Odstat, and I kind of cited this for you below, and I can link the study if any of your listeners want to see it.
We'll put all that in the show notes.
Exactly. So Odestat and the team, and I'm butchering probably what is a beautiful name, essentially says, okay, I'm going to give you a non-oxidized fish oil supplement, a oxidized fish oil supplement, and high oleic sunflower oil. And what I'm going to do is monitor a lot of different markers of oxidation and inflammation. And I'm then going to tell you, does any of this matter? And their peroxide value, I believe, was 45, could have been 42, somewhere in that range. Okay.
So not crazy oxidized.
I mean, so
twice as oxidized as a commercial fish oil ought to be.
Yes,
in the
I don't
case.
think. I think without flavoring, it's very rare to see a truly rancid fish oil, and the reason is the body has these natural mechanisms of resisting rancidity. You were not designed to eat grossly rancid oil. You can smell it, taste it, etc. You are in fact probably the best laboratory marker as to whether or not your supplement is oxidized. The taste of fish oil is, in Todd Cooperman, who's the founder of ConsumerLab.com and does a lot of wonderful things, is fond of saying this. It should be mild. The flavor of fish oil should be mild and not severely offensive when it is not oxidized. And so that's a very important point.
Which is a good guide for buying fish too.
Yeah, precisely. Well, I used to work on a boat, so it was. I always knew what the standard was for like good fish, and everything since has just been tragic. But the point being is that they essentially randomized these subjects to oxidized oil, totox, as I said, around 40 something. And what they determined is that when you look at, kind of the major aldehydes that people care about. So I know, Tugger, you are very fond of the hydroxynonenal, or the HNE and the HHEs. You can go into that in as much explanation.
Well, I'm not fond of them.
Well,
they're the best. They're the best. They're the best studied.
Yes.
So when you're talking about these processes, that's what you're continuously running into. I mean, the nice thing about the two of them is that one comes from omega-6 and the other comes from omega-3, right? The HNE comes from omega-6 and the HHE comes from omega-3. And I've also found some papers just to kind of throw out there saying that the HNE is significantly more toxic than the HHE, which is, to kind of jump the gun here, one reason why an oxidized fish oil may not be the worst thing in the world, even though, but we'll get to that a little later on. There's a lot of interesting data about oxidized fish oil and cuisine and things that we can touch on. But anyway, continue, please.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you kind of leading into that, but that's entirely true. So what you found is that when you eat this oxidized oil, there's really no significant difference in any of these parameters. So we talk about the F2 isoprostanes,
Right.
markers of essentially oxidative stress, C-reactive protein, inflammatory. There's no significant difference. Okay, and that is powerful because there was for a long time this question of does oxidative stress increase when you consume oxidized fish oil? And there's a lot of studies that showed, I think I'm a little incorrect when I said no one's ever tested the oxidized fish oil. People have given very oxidized oils and oxidized omega-3 oils, but it wasn't in like this very controlled trial where you have like an omega-3 fish oil supplement, to my knowledge. Point being, when you give really oxidized omega-3, some people back in the day used to see an elevation in something called malondialdehyde or MDA.
Malondialdehyde, yeah, which is
Malondialdehyde.
one of the annoying things, the annoying markers of PUFA oxidation, because it can come from either the omega-3 or the omega-6 side of the fence. So that's my least favorite biomarker because it doesn't really tell you where the problem's coming from.
No doubt. And so there's this observation MDA increases, malondialdehyde increases when we give some long chain omega-3 when it's oxidized. What does that mean? I don't really know. And so what the industry did for a long time is they said, listen, we're going to add in some tocopherols. So if you look at your little fish oil bottle and you see rosemary extract, tocopherols, that is the point.
Vitamin E, right.
Yeah, vitamin E is to scavenge the radicals that would, kind of give rise to this. And what you have seen is that you don't really see that finding anymore. So a really large review by, I think it was Ismail, who I think probably works for GoEd, finds that MDA is inconsistently elevated with fish oil supplementation. And generally speaking, it almost never is. So for all intents and purposes, I don't consider that a problem for modern day fish oils, but maybe some people do. I just haven't really seen a lot of evidence for it.
Right, that makes sense. Okay. Interesting. So now there was, back to the animal models, there was an interesting paper I found that looked at young mice, I think it was, and fed them oxidized fish oil, and they had very bad outcomes. And they looked at their inflammatory markers, and none of the known inflammatory markers showed any sign of harm, despite the fact that the mice pups were all dead. So clearly there was harm occurring there. But, while that's an interesting finding, and it does suggest that there might be some pathways that these markers aren't tracking, that's one of those animal models that, as we discussed at the beginning, I'm not aware that that translates to any actual human population. So we should probably talk a little bit about oxidized fish oil to the extent you're able to in the regular diet. I mean, I had a good friend whose girlfriend was Norwegian, and at one point he traveled to them for Christmas, and her father had made this Norwegian delicacy, which was basically, and I can't even remember what it's called, this rotten fish concoction. It's like almost pickled fish. And they all thought it was fabulous. And I think my friend had to run out the door when they opened the jar. But, nobody died that I'm aware of. And that's a common item in Scandinavian cuisine. And I mean, back to Japan. For centuries, the Japanese have been preserving fish, right? And that was actually how sushi started, was a means of preserving fish. So while nowadays we all say, oh, sushi, you don't want it to smell fishy at all. Originally, they were rolling it up like that so that it would go less bad. So they were consuming a lot of fish that would probably have tested failure Totox test, I would guess.
Probably. Yeah.
Right. But we're not seeing, there's no, I've looked and I haven't been able to find any indications of harm in humans. Are you aware of
You probably
any?
won't. No, so it's funny because that same author that I just mentioned, that we had this sunflower fish oil, that study,
Right.
they had a subsequent paper in which they took that same data and said, okay, is there any difference in interleukin 6 or oxidized LDL or very specific markers, even the cellular adhesion molecules? If your listeners aren't familiar, the way that you can think about this is that a native LDL particle is not atherogenic, an oxidized LDL particle is atherogenic, and I'm sure you will cover the reasons later as to why that is.
God
But
bless you for saying that.
yeah, well, no, I mean, it's funny. I have no idea. Opine on the topic, probably don't understand the implication of what they're saying.
Well, I've certainly seen cardiologists talk and read papers, and it's not common knowledge, the process of LDL oxidation, as far
Yeah.
as what the research shows and its impact in the progression of cardiovascular disease. But that's a whole nother topic. Let's just kind of say, put that one up there, and maybe we'll have another chat with Dave Feldman or something at some point in the future.
That's totally fine. So essentially, the other side of that is intracellular adhesion molecules, something called VCAM and ICAM. It will seem like I am throwing out these names that don't mean anything to anybody, but VCAM and ICAM are very, very significant because they involve the recruitment of inflammatory molecules into the intima, and therefore they generate the beginnings of an atheroma. Sorry, continue.
Right. Those are the signs, if I remember correctly, or maybe the mechanism by which macrophages are recruited into the arterial intima to start off or respond to the inflammatory process and do whatever they're doing in there. And let's not go into all that stuff, but that's like a key step in atherosclerosis.
Yeah, so inflammatory species entering or through diapedesis, getting through the intima and into the lesion, is in fact pathologic. You cannot, that is a necessary step, if that makes sense. So the point being, and the reason why I brought this up in the context of what you just said, is that when you have this oxidized oil, what you tend to find is that there is in fact a significant, probably, I mean, it says 0.06, but if you look at the data yourself, I've seen other papers that kind of more clearly define this. ICAM is very different in a non-oxidized fish oil supplement versus an oxidized fish oil supplement. So ICAM will actually decrease, VCAM probably does. In other words, what you tend to find is that the ability of a non-oxidized omega-3 to modulate the immune system is probably different. The other interesting point is that in another paper, you see differences in ApoA and ApoB, where non-oxidized fish oil can actually lower ApoB in significant situations. So the point of all of this is that you ask this very interesting question, which is like, if I cook a piece of fish, or I'm pickling fish, and I'm doing all of these things that are necessarily
drying a fish, all the ways that people have of messing up the omega-3 fats in fish.
Yeah, like why is it still good? And so, that's a fascinating question. And this is one of the areas where I'm not going to speak with authority on it, because frankly, I don't think there's a lot of authority to be had other than epidemiology says that it is perfectly safe and individual experience tells you that it's safe. What is interesting?
That said, people, if you go to the supermarket and your fish stinks, you should probably return it.
Yes. Well,
at least that's what I would do.
Yeah, I mean, let me also like footnote or like explain that trying to figure out how to word this. You know how we had that conversation earlier, Tucker, where we said, God, we really want to spare, or gosh, we really want to spare everybody who's listening to this about whether it's a triglyceride or a phospholipid or an ethyl ester or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if you think we need to go into it, let's go into it.
Listen, unfortunately, when you have fish oil in the body, and we can explain this later, what it binds to, or what that omega-3 is going to bind to, is actually pretty important. So there are a number of papers that explore triglyceride versus phosphatidylcholine. So when you conjugate to phosphatidylcholine, the incorporation is very, very different. And in fact, you probably have receptors in your brain. Dr. Patrick, who's one of my beautiful and amazing bosses, has a wonderful piece on this, but it probably makes it.
Kevin Klatt and Tom Brenna, who I interviewed a while ago, recently published a piece showing that PC, omega-3 in a PC is preferentially incorporated into the brain over triglyceride, which has been the source of my advice that, if you want omega-3, you're probably better off by eating a fish than fish oil, because in fish oil, except as you mentioned with the krill oil, which I wasn't aware of, you're based in fish oil, you're getting just the triglyceride form and not the phospholipid form, which contains choline, which affects how it's incorporated into the body's tissues in a beneficial way.
Exactly. And so, like, does albumin cross the brain? This is the kind of thing. You have a blood-brain barrier that does not want to let anything in. So certain receptors are favorably disposed to certain species of fats. So if you and I were a betting man and we were talking about, what's going on here, one would almost imagine that the way in which that fatty acid is conjugated or derived is making a significant difference. And also, look, there's B vitamins in fish. There's a number of very famous neurologists who are now talking about this, but essentially B vitamins magnify the effects there and contain of the omega-3. They probably facilitate absorption. Who knows? But it's probably a mix of things. The point being is, and this is why we go back to this conversation about oxidation, which is when you cook something, it should do all these bad things. Why is it not doing them? And, this is where I say, like, the totox of something probably matters. And we just showed an example of where a really high totox thing did nothing. But, maybe it doesn't. The other thing, by the way, I will mention just, because there's some lipid heads who will get on my case about this. That prior study that I mentioned that had a really high totox, the anisodine value was low. Okay. And again, it's like, why are you talking about an anisodine value that seems esoteric? It's not, because the anisodine value is the secondary oxidation product, which is the sum of aldehydes. So
let's just be clear. In PV and AV, essentially what they're measuring are the things that we consider to be the toxic part of a fish oil.
Yes.
Right. And that's why you're interested in those numbers.
Yes. And so the anisodine value that we just said, if that anisodine value is low, and this is actually how I got the ability to do research with Consumer Lab, is I said, listen, that anisodine value is low. So let's say I and you are saying, I'm worried about an aldehyde because an aldehyde is genotoxic. And somebody says, really? An aldehyde is genotoxic or has any of these effects? And I would say, well, yes. And a good example of that is alcohol, right? So alcohol is a notorious source of aldehydes. When you're consuming alcohol, you are having a higher rate of throat cancer, gastric cancer, et cetera. And no one's batting an eye that the aldehyde derived from alcohol, so alcohol dehydrogenase to aldehyde dehydrogenase, this is how this process is generating this effect. The drug
acetaldehyde is part of the pathway of, just an observation, two observations here. First off, ethanol is a toxin on its own. Fish oil is not.
It is.
Let's be clear there, right? So
yes.
Ethanol is, the body is trying to detoxify it, right? Polyunsaturated fats can turn into toxins that the body is then detoxifying. And the interesting point is the detoxification pathways in the body are common, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're looking, as I mentioned, Ray Peat before, he had a paper showing that fish oil is problematic in the high consumption of ethanol. Part of the reason could be that you're just overwhelming the detoxification pathway, right?
Yeah. No, that's entirely true.
Yeah. So that, absent that high consumption of alcohol, which we know is a bad thing anyway. Yeah. But yeah, these aldehydes are problematic. Again, to back out a step, like lots of things, they're a natural part of our body at the right level. Yes. They're used as signaling molecules. They're, you don't want to go crazy trying to avoid any aldehydes, or you'll wind up not being able to eat anything at all. And that's not good. So,
yeah. And so to that point, you're dealing with a supplement that didn't have a lot of anisodine, and that anisodine value is not significant. And so if you're a very skeptical person, you'd look at that and you go, wait a second, like, yeah, nothing bad was found, but the thing I'm really concerned about wasn't even that high to begin with. And so that totox is different from an isotonic totox with a high AV. Because remember, it's
But
2
they
times the peroxide value plus the anisodine value. So you could have 2 different totox with 2 very different interpretations.
right, and they also weren't measuring. They were measuring inflammatory markers, but they weren't measuring things like DNA damage or
Yeah, I mean, they were measuring like the prostaglandins and glutathione and catalase. So like markers of
right,
what
which are
stress.
markers of oxidative
Yeah,
stress
yeah,
more than actual cellular level damage. But I mean,
yes.
it's a pretty good series of tests to do. I mean, I that's why I found this paper so interesting, is that they're doing a very reasonable battery of tests to show that there's no acute toxicity from this.
Yes, yes, exactly. And so, it's funny that the oxidized fish doesn't matter. I think it's a really interesting question. And like you said, there's probably evidence somewhere that if you eat fresher fish, it could be better for you. I don't really know. The other
Right.
thing is, unfortunately, the way fish is farmed now is such that effectively you don't actually. Okay, so a farm fish is going to have a very different fatty acid composition than a wild fish. I don't know if your listeners know that, but
They
farm fish,
do. We had
yeah,
Tom Brenna, who
yeah,
I think
exactly,
was episode 5, is an expert
yeah.
in that area, and we talked about that at some length, and the
Oh gosh,
whether or
yeah,
not you should eat farmed fish and the pros and cons of it. And I mean, there are pros and cons. It's not a simple farm fish is going to kill you story.
no, not at all. I mean, to even
Right.
suggest that eating a fish is unhealthy is an absurd proposition. So I
Although
won't.
I will say that I once went to a restaurant and ordered salmon, and it was an Atlantic salmon, which meant that it was farmed. And what came out was so fatty, it was repulsive, and I had to
Yeah.
send it back. It was not cooked inappropriately. It was just a big lump of blubber.
Fat.
It was gross.
A lot of
So,
saturated fat, actually. So that's the other irony is that
yeah, but
yeah,
it was not what I was expecting in a
yeah,
salmon.
yeah. It's funny. But yeah, I mean, so that's interesting. I mean, the other thing about this is, and I don't know if you are ready to transition into it yet, but to to understand,
So, okay,
continue.
but before we keep
Yeah,
keep that thought, let's
yeah,
just wrap this up, because I think we've
yeah.
kind of covered it. Your study shows that consumption of oils, that if you're worried about oxidation, you want to avoid the flavored ones. We don't really know if the flavored ones are going to be more harmful, but they do have a higher totox value. So that's a question mark. It's
Yeah, it
probably
would
not
be.
high.
Yeah.
It's probably not high enough to make a big difference, as long as you're getting a high quality fish oil. So even then, I would say probably, if that's your omega-3 source and you don't like the taste and that helps you get over it, my advice, I mean, my personal experience was when I fixed my diet back in 2010, 2011. I started taking fermented cod liver oil, which is
Oh,
probably going to have, that's an interesting question. But at any rate,
fascinating.
I was worried about the oxidation of that. So I bought it not in a capsule, right?
Yeah.
And I ate it every night with a spoon. And because I figured that if it was nasty, I shouldn't be eating it, right? And interesting, nobody else in my family had any interest in eating this stuff. And
I'm sure they did.
for
Yeah.
about 6 months, and it didn't smell bad, I didn't think, but for about 6 months, I literally couldn't get to bed at night without my spoonful of fermented cod liver oil. And then after that, I lost interest, and I've never had another spoonful since.
So funny.
So, I think I was deficient, and I'm not going to go into why, but I think I was deficient at that point, and I remedied a deficiency, and I think it's beneficial that way. But I think the point of your study is that a little bit of oxidation isn't bad. It's not going to kill you. There's no
Yeah.
evidence that it's harmful in the short term. And in the long term, we don't have any evidence that fish is harmful for any human population. So you're probably, so long as you're getting a decent quality fish oil, you're probably not going to be too concerned about. Now, the PCBs are another issue.
They're almost undetectable at this point. I will just note
Okay.
that you're concerned about any of those things. So the extraneous aspects outside of oxidation, the distillation technique, and the way it's processed almost removed any of those concerns.
Okay. So if you're getting one of these oils, and that was actually The one thing I was most interested to see in your paper
Mhm.
was the list of fish oils, and they're not
Yeah,
in there. So tell us
it's
about
just
that.
unfortunately a little bit proprietary. And so if consumers want to, please go to the website consumerlab.com. Because they're paid for by the members themselves, it is theoretically the intellectual property of that entire organization. So I can only make
So
recommendations.
if you subscribe, can you get access to that sort of information?
Yeah, no, we encourage you. So we give the
Okay.
whole list. We give the Totox. So we give the rancidity. We actually just updated the list. So Consumer Lab just updated that list and they added in a bunch of new supplements, their Totox, their concentration. It is a font of information if you actually care about that. And so I really encourage your listeners, if they're interested in fish oil or any of the other supplements they take, to check them out.
Okay, well that's a great piece of information. We
Yeah.
didn't cover that prior to this
Yeah.
discussion. So yeah, that's really neat. And I would think, especially for a healthcare practitioner, that would be
It would
really
be ideal.
fascinating information to have to influence how you're treating a patient population.
Yeah, no doubt. People take a lot of things. So it's good to know whether or not what they're taking is contaminated in any number of ways.
Okay, so that's cool. So the PCB thing, we don't really need to worry about that.
I wouldn't know.
It's
I mean,
just,
I think the
yeah.
bottom line is oxidize or not, you're going to increase fish oil. You're going to have pretty much the same benefits. No evidence right now that's going to do you any harm. And most certainly no evidence that you should curtail your intake of fish, farmed or wild. You should just eat as much fish as you can. No upper limit to my knowledge.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, great. So what was the next point you wanted to bring up?
Well, so listen, I think the commonality with all of these things is an understanding of how an omega-3 or omega-6 fat in general operates in the body. So I think what we just really covered quite in depth was, is there any harm to an oxidized supplement? And once there, what happens? Well, it goes into a red blood cell membrane, it goes into cell membranes, right? So the point of an omega-3 or omega-6, point of a polyunsaturated fatty acid, which is the broader class of those two things, is that they're incorporated into membranes and they alter fluidity, structure, and then the inflammatory crosstalk. And so the reason I say that is because if you don't have a fundamental understanding of why an omega-3 or omega-6 in a particular cell membrane makes any difference, then in my opinion, you don't actually understand the implications of why anybody cares. Like, why do you care, Tucker, about an omega-6 fat?
Exactly.
Like it becomes this arcane, conversation about I
Right.
don't like omega-6. And
Well, it's
so
the health impact is why we care. I mean, we want to
yeah.
know, ideally we want to be in the best health possible because being sicker is miserable.
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
from experience.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
And
and
so
that's,
you and I might have a different you and I might have a slightly different opinion on this. And so I'm also happy to actually adjudicate that point. But what I sort of found interesting was, and maybe in the show notes you could put the diagram showing sort of what we see, which is a breakdown of where omega-6 goes and where omega-3 goes, right? So like in
yeah,
other words, you have a cell membrane, and that cell membrane could be any cell in your body is exposed to a
it's
toxin.
it's
It's
important to
exposed.
know it's all of them.
Yes,
A cell
exactly.
membrane this happens in every single cell in your body. So
Every single cell.
yes, so if this is one of those things where if it gets messed up, let's pause it. If it gets messed up, it can mess up everything.
Yeah, exactly. So you have a bunch of cell membranes in the body. They're ubiquitous. You have some insult. That insult, inflammatory. It could be metal. I don't really care what the insult is. There's some insult. So you got this little membrane. What happens then is that you have something called phospholipase A2 that comes in. It
Right.
liberates that omega-6 or that omega-3 fat. So let's be very clear on an inflammatory cascade, because that's what begins the inflammatory cascade. Omega-6 and omega-3 are inflammatory. Both of them are inflammatory. Okay. One is inflammatory light and immunomodulatory. The other is mostly pro-inflammatory. Okay. So when you're going through and you're saying, listen, omega-3 is it's completely immunosuppressant or something, it's not really the case. It's still going to generate an inflammatory reaction. It's just a very attenuated inflammatory reaction.
Right. There
So
was an interesting paper looking at a mouse model that I think I shared with you where
yes.
they injected HHE, the
Mhm.
aldehyde that comes from DHA, into mice, and it made into mice muscles, I think, and it made the mice insulin resistant. And
Yeah.
I I was very surprised by that because that's not an effect that we seem to see in humans, right? Just because it's in a mouse model doesn't mean that it translates to humans, but it is an indication that these aldehydes can have effects that we may not completely understand, right?
Yeah. I think all of that is true. The only other thing I would say about that particular study is that you have a non-esterified fatty acid, basically. I mean, in this case, it's an aldehyde, but more generally, when you saturate a muscle or any tissue with a free fatty acid or non-esterified fatty acid, you're going to generate insulin resistance. That is a physiologic effect. And
Well,
I won't.
that does depend dramatically on which fat you're using, but
Yes. What I mean to say is,
that's kind of getting off topic of this conversation. But
yes.
I thought it was surprising. I communicated with the senior author on Iraq. Yeah, I think it was the senior author on that paper versus Twitter, and he was emphatic in saying this is a model. We don't have any reason to think that this happens in humans. And I was like, okay, well, that makes perfect sense. But it's, in some of these inflammatory conditions, you see declines in both omega-6 and omega-3 fats. So it's not out of the question that in that circumstance, the omega-3s could be breaking down into these products and they could be having some effect on the body. I mean, it wouldn't be shocking if that's happening.
Yeah, I would say that's fair. I'm hesitant. I understand the
So,
hesitation.
I mean, I say that in the sense of that's why I'm interested in this topic, because I like to understand these areas. Not that I think we put the fish oil piece in the fish to bed, that there's no good evidence that they're harmful in humans. So
Yeah,
that's an interesting factoid, right? I don't know that it has any relevance, and I wouldn't tell anybody not to consume fish because of that paper.
yeah. I mean, listen, that makes sense. And so to the, I think the broader point is that, like, essentially, when you consume omega-3 or omega-6, you're generating some inflammatory reaction that initiates with phospholipase A2, liberating a particular fatty acid from that membrane. You have an omega-6 fat. The omega-6, let's just take the canonical example here, which is the linoleic acid. Tucker, I hope that's okay with you to mention it by name.
Oh
Yeah,
no.
no, yeah. So you have, but well, there's
No,
actually,
everybody who talks to me is well acquainted with that particular fat. Yes, go ahead.
yeah, yeah. So what is linoleic acid? Linoleic acid is C 18 2 and it's N6. So you'll see a C, that's just the number of carbons, 18. So it's 18 carbons long. There's a colon, there's the number 2, okay, and then there's N6. 2 is the degree of unsaturation. So there's 2 double bonds that are
Which
in the
means
linoleic.
it's missing a certain amount of hydrogens.
Yes. In other
The
words,
other way to look at it, right?
yeah, that's it's actually interesting. I don't frequently. It's been a long time since I looked at it like that, but that's true. So
Well,
you're
that's what hydrogenation is.
yes,
You add hydrogen
yes,
to linoleic acid and you get stearic acid, which is fully hydrogenated, has a full complement of hydrogen atoms. So I find it's easier to think of it that way.
yeah. No, it really is. I thank you for saying that. That actually colors a lot of it. And so, anyways, you have linoleic acid, so it's 18-2. The first step, once you cleave that with phospholipase A2 for the membrane, is essentially you're having this. Well, let's not even go there. I kind of want to back up. You
Go ahead.
mentioned, yeah. So I actually find this interesting to say, just so that people have an understanding of kind of how these things go. So you just said you have linoleic acid, and it basically is double bonded, right? So it has these degrees of unsaturation. So the point is, the body processes all of these fats in different ways. So your linoleic acid, the first thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to be operated on by a delta 6 desaturase, which is, I believe, controlled by FADS2. And so from the linoleic acid, you're going to go into the gamma linoleic acid, which is 18-3. So what a
Right.
desaturase does.
So what he's describing now is the process of essentially upsizing linoleic acid, right? Because what the body's more interested in some ways are longer chain fatty acids like arachidonic acid, which is highly useful in immune function, right? And is an essential fatty acid in the human body. So one of the ways that we can get that is, if you're not eating it directly, you can make it via this process from linoleic acid.
Yes, exactly. So again, what the body's interested in is generating an inflammatory reaction. So anytime you liberate, you generate that oxylipin. So linoleic acid that's liberated from cell membranes and oxylipin. More specifically, these things are probably going to become or should be classified as eicosanoids. Neither here nor there. This is technical jargon. The point being, body's interested in generating arachidonic acid because that is its inflammatory chemical messenger, which it's going to start deriving a lot of its inflammatory cytokines. So you have a delta 6 desaturase, you've turned the linoleic acid into a gamma linoleic acid. So that is adding 1 degree of unsaturation. Instead of being 18.2, it is now 18.3. You are then throwing an elongase at that. That elongase is adding 2 carbons. So a desaturase is adding 1 double bond. An elongase is adding 2 carbons. So you now have a different kind of essentially linolenic acid. And then you're going to eventually go with 1 more desaturase, which is the delta 5 desaturase, to arachidonic acid, which is C24. So you have 4 degrees of unsaturation, and then you have a 20-chain carbon. Arachidonic acid, you can think of as the prototypical or canonical, I guess you could call it lipid signaling molecule. So it's when you're talking about an inflammatory lipid mediator from an omega-6 fatty acid, that's arachidonic acid. Okay. Right. Arachidonic acid produces something called through COX, prostaglandin H. Prostaglandin H is kind of the main player that is going to give rise to prostaglandin E2, PGI2, and then thromboxane A2. Why do I tell you any of these things and these weird names? That's because when you have an infection, you have flu, whatever you have, any kind of insult to the body, and you get a temperature, it's coming from this process, generally speaking. Yes, there's interleukin-1 beta, et cetera, but this is one of the ways that you're generating inflammation in the body is through the prostaglandin system and through
it's important to note that in the right degree, all of this stuff is beneficial, right? This is not a pathological process that you're describing. Inflammation and this, upsizing of, making arachidonic acid so that you can seed it around the body in the membranes so that when your body needs it to fight off an infection, it's there, is a very important process.
Yeah. And this is sort of, the broad point of what we're getting at is that, inflammation is both necessary, but the products actually downstream are useful. So when we think about arachidonic acid, we just said it's, metabolizing into prostaglandin H, which is then giving rise to PGE, PGI, and thromboxane A2. Thromboxane, and the reason why we care about this is aggretory for platelets. It clots, does all sorts of nasty things. And so does PGE2. PGE2 does all sorts of things.
Don't say nasty. They're all good things in the right amount.
Well,
I mean, if you at one point I was taking baby aspirin and I fell off my mountain bike and got a cut. And I usually stop bleeding instantly.
Yeah.
I think 45 minutes later, I was still bleeding because aspirin blocks the COX pathway that generates thromboxane that helps you clot, right? That's why the negative effect of aspirin is that people suffer from these bleeding episodes. And it can be extremely problematic. So
yeah, I mean, that's totally correct. The reason I say nasty is that when you think about somebody at high cardiovascular risk and you're worried about them, you think about the thromboxanes. But the reason why I even bothered to mention any of this is because what's so interesting is that you produce PGE2 and thromboxane A2. We argue that these things are thrombotic. Maybe they do nasty things to the endothelium in addition to their valuable role in inflammation. PGI2, not so much. PGI2 is dilatory and it has positive effects on various aspects of the vascular system. So it's quite interesting that the inflammatory product is also producing a, generally speaking, beneficial or less inflammatory compound, which is PGI2. Now, arachidonic acid through lipoxygenase, or LOX, is also going to produce a series of leukotrienes. These are going to, again, be inflammatory signaling species, but also lipoxins. And it sounds like, again, I'm using weird words, but I think that this is a really valuable concept that you've just alluded to, which is I've gone down this inflammatory pathway. This inflammatory pathway is useful, but what it is also doing
necessary.
I mean, you couldn't survive without it. I mean, of course. But what it's also doing is producing anti-inflammatory or beneficial species. So a lipoxin is a beneficial species, and it comes from arachidonic acid directly. And so what is so remarkable about this to me is that, you can give somebody arachidonic acid, and I actually have that included in here. And arachidonic acid is just such the prototypical, like you don't want to have too much of it. And yet you see inconsistent results. Okay. And it's not at all clear what happens even in systematic review of arachidonic acid administration. And part of the reason that, should be considered here is that you're downstream of all inflammatory products going to be producing anti-inflammatory or pro-resolving mediators in various forms. The main one here that we're talking about is lipoxin, but PGI2 is another good example of that.
Right, right. Yeah, no, that's a great point to make. I mean, in a lot of the papers I've looked at, looking at the arachidonic inflammatory pathway, it's highly regulated. It's probably, it's fair to say, one of the most important pathways in the body. It can get off kilter, but it doesn't get off kilter by much. So,
Yeah.
And I've talked to a gentleman by the name of Bruce Hammock, who discovered the soluble epoxy hydrolase, which is kind of an end stage in that pathway. And what he discovered was that by suppressing that enzyme, you were keeping a class of arachidonic acid anti-inflammatory compounds in the body longer. And he discovered remarkable effects on the healing capacity of organisms. He has a story of this horse they were about to put down, and because they were it was lame and, couldn't walk, and they gave it this SEH inhibitor, and it healed up in like a week. Right? It was astonishing.
Yeah.
So yeah,
no, it really is.
Yeah, it's an amazing, amazing little story. There's a much longer story behind all that, why we're not seeing those chemicals in, the pharmacy. But anyway, yeah, I mean, and it's, you're making great points here. These are complicated pathways, and it's just too, whenever there's a lot of nuance. But thank you for bringing up all the nuance.
So in many ways, omega-3 and omega-6 are in competition with each other on this fundamental inflammatory level. And that is why omega-3 is immunomodulatory. Does that make sense?
Well, I don't think competition is the right word to use, right? I think what we're looking for is a balance.
Yeah, I suppose competition is perhaps a harsh way of putting it.
Right. I mean, they do compete for desaturation pathways and all of that. But ideally, and that's, one of the common observations about the problem with the Western diet is that you've got this mass excess of omega-6 versus omega-3. And one of the reasons we think that's a problem is because you don't have this balance of pro and anti-inflammatory molecules. When your body has a problem, it needs both of them, right? It needs the entire suite of tools that it can use to deal with the problem at hand.
Yeah, and I think that's totally fair. I mean, I say competition just because essentially they're antagonistic to each other. But yeah, you raise a fundamental point. It's probably better to say balance.
Have you looked into, I asked because I haven't, have you looked into the effect of the resolvins on macrophage and neutrophil behavior? I mean, are they the stand down signal? Because we're assuming by this point in the inflammatory process, the macrophages and the neutrophils, two types of white blood cells, are activated and are out there trying to fight off whatever insult or do whatever repair needs to be done. These are part of the signal that's saying, okay, it's like the firemen have put out the fire and they're ready to go back to the firehouse now, sort of thing.
Yeah. And so, I actually want to defer to a few people. One is Charles Sirhan, who really has been the main figure in all of this. I mean, so you go back in the day, he's done a remarkable job of proving that these things exist and they're biologically meaningful. So there was some controversy not too long ago that does an SPM exist? Is it biologically meaningful? That has since been cleared up, at least to my understanding, by a number of people in the field. I would say in terms of my own experience with it, it has been cleared up. They likely exist and they're biologically relevant. So you ask a very good question, which is, do those E-series resolvins put a stop to things? I'd like to go further down that pathway to DHA or docosahexaenoic acid. That's C22 and 6. C22, 6, and 3. So in other words, 6 degrees of unsaturation, 22 carbons. That is
the fat that everybody thinks of when they think of fish oil.
Yes, it is often thought of as the brain fat or the retina fat because there's the highest concentration in those areas. In reality, and Bill Harris talks about this a lot, I don't really know what that means. Like if you give EPA... Yeah.
but I mean, humans who are deficient in that developmentally have bad outcomes. So it's,
Yes.
the relevance to adults is somewhat less obvious, but you clearly
Yeah.
need those when you're developing.
Yes,
Clearly
of
need
course.
that when you're developing.
Yes, and so to be clear, I'm not saying like I don't know what the relevance is like in development. What I mean to say is that if you're an adult and you're thinking, oh gosh, I need my brain to get bigger, my eyes to get better, the administration flatly of DHA, at this point, there's no good evidence that that is going to significantly prevent anything that you're concerned with. It may do beneficial things, but again, these are very unclear in meta-analysis as to what they do. What a lot of the resolvins are doing, and you also have protectins and merisins, these are all DHA derived, some of them are EPA derived, is that they're polarizing that macrophage from M1 to M2. Okay. And so what that means is that you're changing the fundamental characters, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in some way, if you're going to trivialize. It's obviously more complicated than that. I'm just using
Well,
this.
again, back to the fireman analogy, the same guy who comes in and breaks down your door with an axe is going to be the guy who picks you up and carries you out and, puts you in a stretcher outside the house, right? It's just a necessary difference of behavior.
Yes, exactly. And so, what we're really seeing with all of this is that when you start polarizing those macrophages, you see, it really does change the the immunotypic character of your system. So if it's more pro-inflammatory in nature, these are going to be more pro-resolving in nature and fundamentally address the underlying pathophysiology of the immune system. So if your problem is that you have a very swollen part of your body or you have this particular area that is beset by inflammation, if I just stop that inflammatory pathway and I just say, listen, I'm going to get no more inflammatory species, I haven't actually resolved the problem. Right?
Right.
I've not actually dealt with that underlying inflammation because there's no resolution that has taken place. And
Right.
so
Which is why when we see NSAIDs, they look at NSAIDs and like the healing of a tendon, they actually retard healing because they're impairing the process of the inflammatory process, which is a beneficial process when it's a response to an insult, right? I mean, and then we should probably get into, all of this activity starts being harmful when it's not occurring in response to the type of insult that we want it to respond to, right? I mean, if you get a cut or an infection or a burn or whatever else, this is a process that you want to have happen to the right degree so that it can heal it. The problem
yes,
we start to see is when you get, they use this term now, sterile inflammation. You have an inflammatory process going on in the body and there's no insult, right? So you have these very, this is the firemen show up at your house and break down the door and you're like, but my house isn't on fire. And,
yeah,
that's atherosclerosis, for instance. That's part of the process that's happening there. This has been a fascinating discussion on how these things are happening in the body and the balance that's going on. I mean, you're very you have a great facility with this. It's one of the cardinal. You must be a very good med student because med students seem to have these incredibly capacious memories for obscure terms that cause people to run away at cocktail parties when used in excess.
It's true. I mean, part of it is that I really love this particular class of compounds. And
It's a fascinating area.
I was
Absolutely.
talking to Avendra Nath, who's at the NIH, who's doing a lot of research into neurovirology and lots of crazy things. And so I was having this conversation with him, and I said, I don't understand why, when you think about so much of the brain in neurological problems that come from a persistent inflammatory state or even an acute inflammatory state like stroke, are coming from basically just so much macrophage penetration and inflammatory species that are just kind of destroying the vasculature. And I thought to myself, and I asked him, why is the SPM class not being more broadly tested? And the most fabulous answer I got was, I think we should, and I think they're trying to now. I don't know. And I was like, it's insane to me. I think these are incredible compounds, and I think there are some trials going on right now.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people out there that are really bullish on SPMs. I'm one of them. I'm not blind to them. I will tell you that, like you said, M1, M2 macrophage, pro-inflammatory macrophage, they have a very distinct role. So like if you have a malignancy, God forbid, you don't want a lot of M2s. Those M2s are actually what promote tumorigenic spread. And
Oh, because
so
they're suppressing the inflammatory
yes,
response.
and so that was one of the funnier findings in prostate cancer is that M2 is doing all. And so if you look into it, you'll sit there and you
Right.
go, I don't know why Tucker had this guy on, man. He's telling me to take this. That's insane. And the point is, like you just said really well, is that there's such a balance going on that it's difficult to take things in isolation. All I will
Right.
say is that when you talk about omega-3 fatty acids and their metabolism, you really should talk about the appearance of the SPMs that are derived from there and the really magical things that they can do for the body and aging more generally.
Yeah, I will confess that I've not spent as much time looking into the inflammation resolution part of the pathway. Mainly, I've been interested in the pathological part of it. I
Yes.
wrote a long time ago, just because that's, honestly the most generally relevant part, I think, to public health at this point. I wrote a bunch of posts years ago on my blog talking about inflammation and the problems with. One of them is rice, RICE, what is it, rest, ice, compression, and elevation,
Mhm.
is rice paleo. And it was kind of a joke, but it
Yeah.
was looking at the problem with applying ice to wounds, right?
Yeah.
Which reduces inflammation and is one of these things that never should have made it into evidence-based medicine because there was no
Yeah.
evidence for it.
Yeah.
And even the guy, Dr. Gabe Merkin, who came up with the idea, finally said, okay, anything that impairs inflammation in the context of wound healing is probably a bad idea. We shouldn't be doing that anymore. And nevertheless, I went through a medical first aid course last year,
Mhm.
and they mentioned Dr. Merkin, and they mentioned that rice hadn't been shown to be effective and was in fact slightly harmful. And
That's
yet,
interesting.
nevertheless, they were still doing it. They said, well, just don't do it as long. And I was like, how about we not do it at all if it's
Yeah.
harmful?
Yeah. It's very interesting. I don't actually know, but you bring up a fascinating question, which is like, where's that balance struck, and how do you sort of
Right.
modulate it? And it's a great question. I actually don't know.
Yeah, so you're definitely going into an area where I haven't spent a lot of time looking at. It's
Well, I would
necessary.
encourage
It's
all of your listeners to get into SPMs. Really, I would.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to cut you off. It's such a beautiful field.
Now, is there anything you can buy at this point, or is it still just a research field?
No, there is. So Metagenics makes a product called SPM Active. So unfortunately, now we're sort of getting into more of my domain, which is looking at who makes what and what is the
Okay.
quality. Metagenics makes SPM Active that's done in partnership with Lipid. I don't remember the company, but point being, they make this product. It's
Okay.
concentrated
So this
dose.
isn't a purely academic interest.
No, oh no, it actually had a clinical trial in which they looked at, I think, osteoarthritis outcomes, and they
Okay.
actually measured IL-6 and a bunch of different metrics about disability, in addition to, of course, the biochemical outcomes. And fascinatingly, IL-6 went down. There was all sorts of
Interesting.
interesting parametric changes. So basically, those things were biologically active, and they were good at what they were doing. So I at that point became very interested when I saw that data, and I don't think it's in sort of the outline for this, but I'm happy to include it. But great paper. Point being, there's that Pure Encapsulations, Da Vinci. There's a bunch of companies that make it. The question is does it matter? Do I recommend taking it? How's the oxidation? I don't have an answer to any of those questions. I
Okay.
think it's too
But
risky.
it's interesting. And I mean, it sounds like one of those things that if I don't know. I mean, my approach is first pass is always to, and this is my engineering experience. First pass is always to try and get the system back to the known good state, right?
Yeah.
And then you can start playing around with how to tweak it. I can't even remember what it was now, but I took I'll put this in the show notes or maybe flash it up on the screen
Yeah.
afterwards because I can't remember what it was, but I got this idea in my head to take some supplement and it made me feel a little bit better. I thought that there may have been a genetic defect in this area and that ran in the family. And so I started taking it and I was like, oh, okay, I feel a little bit better. And then I had this terrible injury in the back of my leg, which was kind of weird because I never have anything like that happen. And then I got a mouth sore, and I got a bone spur growing out of the middle of this open spur in my mouth. I put a picture on Twitter. It was horrible. It's like growing a tooth out of the side of your mouth, cutting into my tongue.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, stop the supplement. And one of the side effects of this supplement was, you know, mouth sores, but they never mentioned anything about a bone spur sticking out. I mean,
Interesting that you call it a supplement, Tucker. I think we're on the same page, but it's quite fascinating that it would be referred to as a supplement.
yeah, I don't remember. Can't remember right now which one it was, but I don't take it anymore. And I stopped immediately when that happened, obviously, because it was the only supplement I was taking. And I'd never had anything like that happen in my entire life. My father-in-law happens to be a dentist, and I sent him a picture of it, and he was like, oh my God, I've never seen anything like this.
Oh, that's funny. I'm sorry. Well, it looks like you're feeling better.
Oh no, you know,
good.
It's all fine now. It healed up sooner, you know, in a little while. It was fine. But I'm always super leery about supplements, just because when you start throwing any system off kilter, right, it's tough to predict what's actually going to happen.
Yeah, a lot of moving parts to any supplement game, which is why
yeah,
people take a lot of supplements. Most doctors will tell you stop taking the supplements because in general the whole foods are going to do you better.
Well, good doctors will tell you that.
Yeah, I suppose it depends on the interest.
So you wanted to get a little bit into omega-6.
Would you hate me if I did, Tucker? Because I
not at
think
all. No, I think
maybe split hairs.
Go ahead, fire away.
Yeah. So listen, here's my thing: is that like O'Keefe back in 2016 or 2018 with I think Nicolantino had a really interesting piece in the BMJ.
He asked me to be a co-author on that paper, but I decided
did he
it
really?
wasn't a great idea.
No way! How interesting.
Yeah,
I really like James.
I mean, James, I think, you know, Dr. O'Keefe. I saw a him give a talk at Harvard University for the Ancestral Health Symposium in 2012, and it was about how running is bad for you. And I happened to be sitting next to Dan Lieberman, who at the time was the chairman of I think he still is, but at the time he was the chairman of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard and the world expert on running and barefoot running in human evolution. And his response to O'Keefe's speech was exactly the same as mine. That's ridiculous.
Really? Well, I have to talk to you about that because that actually I've heard outside of him that there's optimums associated with cardiovascular exercise, but that's interesting.
Well, it's cardiovascular exercise, particularly running, I'll say, because that's where I've done the most exercise. Again, you would assume that at some point there's too much, right?
Yeah.
Neither with omega-3s or with running have we found the upper limit to the health benefit. And they've looked at ultra runners, you know, people who do, you know, an ultra runner is somebody who does longer than marathon length races, right? And I mean, there's a woman who just finished, I think she did an ultra marathon a day for 200 days consecutively. There doesn't seem to be an upper limit for the benefit. I mean,
how do you feel about higher CAC? I'm not trying to go too off topic. I'm just trying to pick your brain about this. So, like one of the findings
that is a finding, right? So they tend to have more atrial fibrillation and they tend to have more calcification, but they have lower mortality from cardiovascular disease and lower mortality from everything, in fact. So, yeah, there's and I would wager that, you know, all the runners that I know eat crap diets. Based on what I know about arterial calcification and atrial fibrillation, I would guess that's primarily coming from the diet. And it's probably a factor of, you know, if you run a machine on a poor quality fuel, you're probably going to have worse performance out of the machine than if you're running it on the optimal fuel. And a lot of what runners eat, I can't, you know, I don't think anybody could really call it optimal. I mean, it may be optimal for short-term performance, and that's fine, but, you know, I don't think it's optimal for long-term health. It's pretty much equates to a junk food diet a lot of the time, although they're getting better. And there are a lot of people who, you know, Zach Bitter, who pretty much does a paleo diet and has had great success. He's got a few world records. So I don't think you have to have a junk food diet to be a good runner. But
Well, that's
yeah, so
interesting.
no, I'm very familiar with that paper, and they make some good arguments. I think it kind of comes back down to the same thing that we were talking about with omega 3s, right? I'm not
Mhm.
aware of any population that takes high consumption of omega 3s and has a health problem. And in fact, you generally see that they are healthier. The Japanese, one of the longest lived big populations in the world, right? I mean, the one negative I've heard of was that they said that the Greenland Eskimos were, they thought had a higher stroke risk and they were more predisposed to bleeding. Those concerns haven't borne out in fish oil trials. And because of the small population, they weren't doing RCTs with these people. That was just
Yeah.
anecdotes. It may have just been artifactual.
Well, genotypic differences also, especially in isolated populations, is going to make like a
Yeah, I
huge.
mean, there's a lot of reasons why that could happen. So the flip side, omega 6 intake, right? Is there a population with an evolutionarily appropriate level of omega 6 intake that has our chronic diseases? And I found one. I finally did find one. But with that one exception, no.
Yeah. Well, so here's sort of my thing on this is that I've seen that hypothesis. I just linked that paper because I think it provides a very fair
No, and
kind
it's a good paper and they have a lot of you know, there are a lot of good references in there. I don't think they make a strong enough argument. I probably should have, in hindsight, you know, worked with him on that, but I don't know. He gets into some flaky stuff that makes me a little nervous sometimes.
I understand. Well, what I'm saying is, it provides a good overview of
Yeah.
sort of how to think about this mechanistically. So, you have people like, I'm trying to remember who, I mean, God knows, like Lane Norton, Nick Norwitz, probably
No,
all
well, Nick, I know well. I think he and I are generally in agreement.
really, okay, because
Unless you're
I thought
thinking
it
of
was
Nick
much more.
Hebert.
Oh, maybe I am. I was trying to
Oh
remember
God, poor
who
Nick's
was
going to
so.
die if you just made that mistake.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, tell him I'm sorry. I was. It was in reference to essentially that there's like a hullabaloo about omega 6 that's unfounded. I think so you might be right. It could be Nick Hebert. I'll have to
Yeah,
double
Nick
check.
Nick Norwitz and I are. I mean, we have some slight differences, but I think we're generally in agreement. I've done a couple of podcasts with him, and I talk to him
Oh,
pretty
great.
regularly.
Okay, so listen, I definitely take your word for it. I apologize to Mr. Norwitz if that's the case. But the reason I mention this is that I think that there's like a very big camp that does not understand, why you feel the way you do about omega 6, and there's another camp that thinks that omega 6 is kind of the be all end all. So the because we've had to survey the literature now multiple times on this, I have seen, let me preface this, so I apologize. I've seen no convincing evidence that omega 6 in any capacity is in a significant way on a population level leading to the health outcomes of leading to health outcomes that are reminiscent of most chronic disease. What I have seen, and I'm giving a very generous take on this, and I've linked several
Yep.
of the papers, is that you'll see modest effect size. So on some papers that do systematic analysis, you'll see 5, 10%, sometimes 20% relative or essentially relative risk increase associated with higher omega 6 intake. Now, the problem with this is that let's say I go to essentially LA and I say, well, what's going on with LA? And, is that making any difference? And let's just say
You mean
diabetes.
linoleic acid?
Yes.
Oh,
And so,
sorry.
no, no, you're fine.
Okay.
Well, no,
I
I'm
didn't know
from
you
LA.
meant like LA, the city or something.
No, 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 no. I apologize. I'm
Okay.
from LA, so perhaps it's biased. But yeah, take linoleic acid, right? So really interesting paper measures linoleic acid in multiple do in linear doses and
Yep.
in adipose tissue. So when it's deposited in the fat and linear associations in terms of intake. And so what you find is that as linear intake goes up, the risk of type 2 diabetes goes down. And this was in not one, but I believe now 3 studies I've linked here. Again, if you say that omega 6 in and of itself, so not the ratio of omega 3 to omega 6, but the omega 6 in and of itself is an issue. I cannot imagine that finding necessarily being the case. Second, and I will appropriately let you respond to this in as much detail because I'd be curious. I just mentioned that arachidonic acid, when I when you give it to people, right? Like, so you say, I'm going to increase arachidonic acid intake in meta-analysis. You don't actually see consistent differences in markers of inflammation. And so what I'm left with is this very complex understanding in which I would say, listen, and this is where I think a lot of the people who give you a lot of flack is like, I've seen a lot of animal models that say omega-6 is, terrible, but I've seen no good clinical evidence of it. But what I have seen good clinical evidence is that omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is important, and that probably having a higher ratio of omega-3 is important. That is indisputable. But I just don't see the
Right.
effect sizes.
Yeah, well, I think omega-3 can be a confounder for some of the reasons we discussed before, right? It takes the place of omega-6 in tissues, and that can affect the products that are being produced in the body, right?
Uh-huh.
So that's, for instance, in the animal model of obesity, that's my favorite animal model coming out of the NIH. The last podcast I did, episode 10 with Dalton Graham, reproduced that study. And what they found is DHA is protective against obesity in the animal model because DHA is taking the place of arachidonic acid in the gut wall. And the gut wall is therefore not producing the endocannabinoids that are triggering hyperphagia, right? So there's confounders, right? Absolutely, no question about it. I think that's one of the reasons why when we look at two similar populations side by side, one of them is having an obesity epidemic and the other is not, and they're genetically very similar, and I'm referring to China and Japan.
Yeah.
Japan has a high intake of fish and DHA and has for a long time, right? Even though, I mean, if we judge those two populations by the ALDH 2*2 mutation, they both have about 50% of that mutation, right? That's, I think, a 3,000 to 5,000 year old mutation. So these are basically two identical populations that are having a very different experience right now. And DHA consumption could be explaining that, right? So when you say population studies, who are your controls?
Yeah, and I think I brought this up with you.
Yeah, you did. You put it in the document.
Yeah, there is no sufficient control for omega-6 because omega-6 is everywhere. I understand.
It's ubiquitous.
Yeah.
Right.
But that still doesn't change, and this is why I brought it up. The linear association that you see, the inverse linear association that you see in meta-analysis for several different conditions with linoleic acid.
I've looked through a lot of those. One of the papers that you saw was a Dariush Mozafarian paper.
Yes. Yes.
And I've gone through his line of research. The first paper in the line that I'm going to discuss was something he did in 2011, where he looked at the obesogenic quality of foods in the American diet, right? Looking at the nurses' health. They did 3 studies. I can't remember the name of them off the top of my head, but one of them was the nurses' health study, and then there was like a physician's health study, and a third. And they went through and analyzed obesity based on all the foods that everybody ate. And the most obesogenic food, far and away, were fried potatoes, right?
Yes.
Like 5 to 7 times as obesogenic as everything else in the diet. They compared them, and the way they presented the data was, let's just say, if I had seen somebody doing this back in my Wall Street career, when my job was identifying fraud, I would have called this fraud. They were trying to hide a result, right? Because what they didn't make clear, and in fact, what did they say? They said, here are fried potatoes, they're highly obesogenic, and they combined certain kinds of fried potatoes with other kinds of unfried potatoes, like mashed potatoes, boiled potatoes, and which are not obesogenic, right? So what's the difference between a French fry and a boiled potato, right? One has 2 ingredients, potato and salt, and the other has 3 ingredients, potato, salt, and seed oils, right? So they found that the most obesogenic food is this food that's high in seed oils and is very high in the diet, and where we have a clear pathway from the product, the French fry, to the end result, obesity, right? Through an omega-6 dependent pathway. Okay. So Then he comes out with another paper, and they look at linoleic acid consumption in the United States, and they find that there is a linear relationship, and diabetes, and they find that there is a linear direct relationship between omega-6 consumption and diabetes in the United States.
Hold on. Would you submit, or at least grant, that the majority of papers looking at that have found the opposite?
Let's talk about what they did next.
Okay.
They adjusted it by body weight, body mass. But they already knew that body mass is in the pathway that they're looking at because they published a paper showing that, right? And I wasn't the only one who noticed this. Joseph Hibeln, I wrote a post about this, and then after the post, somebody pointed out, oh, this guy commented on their paper saying that the explanation could be that linoleic acid is causing obesity in the French fries, right? Hibeln wrote the 2012 paper that I mentioned showing the animal pathway to obesity. Okay, so if you take a causal pathway, it is invalid to adjust the end result by another component of the same causal pathway, right? You're hiding the result, right? It would be like if you can help me with a better analogy, please, but this is the only one I've been able to come up with. If you analyze the mortality of gunshot wounds and then adjusted it by bleeding, you could find that gunshot wounds aren't fatal when they're adjusted for bleeding, right? Because you're taking this and you're adjusting it by this when the correct association is really this, right? I went, and I have a pretty good, I'm not formally trained in statistics, but I did spend a couple decades of my life in Wall Street working with risk models and statistics and statistical analysis of data sets. So I have a pretty good idea what's going on, but I did reach out to a professional statistician and ask him about this. And he was like, his response was, they're cheating, right? They're adjusting by the causal pathway. Now, okay, so this is my opinion. A couple of years ago, they wrote a paper where they explicitly said that it's invalid to adjust diabetes by obesity because it's in the causal pathway. So then Mozaffarian goes on and writes, I don't know if it's this paper particularly, but there was another paper he wrote, which was a meta-analysis of all these papers showing no relationship between diabetes and linoleic acid, and every single one was adjusting for BMI, right? That's invalid. That is, in my opinion, in my experience on Wall Street, if I did that and my bosses found out about it, I mean, I would be worried about going out in handcuffs led by the SEC. And now why should we think that this is a real pathway? Because since the 1960s, the standard way to induce insulin resistance in humans has been injecting them with soybean oil.
Yeah, so I want to see that, like, the obesity aspect of this is not my strength for a number of reasons. So I've actually read back and forth criticisms about whether or not it induces obesity. I'm not sure. It's
a big and very complicated topic, and
I'm sure it is. And I don't presume. Listen, when you start getting to the hypothalamus and what regulates GLP, GIP, and how that interacts with the pituitary, it's a lot. The hunger center is a notoriously complicated thing that I don't want to touch.
Just one point I wanted. So I'm directly attacking Mozaffarian, who is one of the biggest figures in nutrition, right? I'm accusing him of not essentially research misconduct. I am accusing him of research misconduct here. Okay.
Yes.
Be perfectly clear about that. So recently,
I think it's clear.
Mozaffarian, there's an article, I think in the Atlantic, talking about some of his research, where he found that, he's a big pro-dairy guy, and I commend him for that. And he actually patented, while he was at Harvard, a fat found in dairy as protective against diabetes. Interesting little trivia there. Okay. A trans fat, by the way, interestingly enough. So he did this paper where he said that that there was no evidence of harm from dairy, and in fact, it was protective. And the most protective part of dairy was yogurt, right? Great. Everybody loves yogurt. I grew up when I grew up, there were ads on TV all the time talking about this population in Russia somewhere who ate lots of yogurt and lived forever, right? So, well, everybody loves yogurt. But that wasn't all that he found. Just like in the potato paper, he found that there was something else that was just as beneficial as yogurt, and that's ice cream. Mm-hmm. But he didn't include that in his analysis. And when they interviewed him about it, he said, yeah, I forget exactly the language, but it was basically, yes, that paper wasn't entirely accurate. Okay, well, hiding research findings is scientific misconduct. So he's admitted that he does it. So, okay, so we get back to, three things. We have very problematic epidemiology done by people like Dariush Mozaffarian, where you have no control population. We have the worst part of the evidence, but the most conclusive, I don't want to say conclusive, the strongest, the biggest effect, the part that shows the biggest effect are the population studies, right? Mm-hmm. Where populations that don't eat industrial diets, what we call Western diets, don't have high rates of diabetes anywhere in the world, okay? And then we have the mechanism.
Sorry, just to, because I want to earmark what you just said, because I think it's very interesting and directly bears on the point of what we're talking about right now.
Right.
Because I see something in a population average, like, yes, the U.S. eats a lot of omega-6. The U.S. is also fat and intakes sugar like there's no tomorrow. And the U.S. also drinks in amounts and things that other countries don't. In other words, so whenever I hear that argument, I find it very difficult. Because
I did preface that with, this is the worst part of the evidence.
Oh, listen, I understand. I completely get it. I'm just sort of asking. So, like, take that gentleman out of the equation. So okay. I could show you other, and I've linked them. I could show you a lot of other papers, Cochrane type papers, etc., where you can sample somebody's adipose tissue for linoleic acid, and you find an inverse risk associated with diabetes.
That's the problem. You don't. If you look at the United States over the past century, and Stefan Guillenet did a paper launch. So, okay, I'll link to this in the show notes, but there's a paper by a guy named Pierce looking at the epidemiology of ubiquitous factors, right? And the example they always give for this is smoking, right? Mm-hmm. If you're doing epidemiology on a group of smokers, and they're all smokers, right? And you're examining people who smoke 2 packs a day versus people who smoke 5 packs a day, you might not find a risk of smoking for lung cancer. Why? Because the risk from lung cancer starts when you get to 1 pack a day, and they're both way past that list, right? It's ubiquitous in both sides, so you don't have a good control. Right.
So listen, I'll see this to you.
Okay.
I really will.
So wait. So what the point that Pierce made in this paper is that when you're looking at ubiquitous risk factors, there are things that we do standardly that don't work, right? Cohort studies don't work. RCTs don't work. If you're going to do an RCT on giving people linoleic acid, where are you going to find the group of people that's not eating it in an industrial country?
Sure.
Right? You can't. So, and his response was, in that case, when you're looking at a ubiquitous factor, you have to start looking at populations longitudinally, or you have to find a population, which is, what Weston Price famously did, went around the world and looked for people who didn't have the high rates of dental disease that he saw in his practice here in the United States and tried to figure out what the difference was, right? You need to do stuff like that. If you look at population intake of seed oils in the United States and diabetes prevalence in the United States, it goes up in lockstep. Absolutely goes up in lockstep. And that's all the way back to the middle of the 19th century, when diabetes stopped being a rare disease and seed oils were introduced to the population. And that's in adipose tissue goes up. Are there a lot of other factors that can affect this? Yes, there are genetic factors. There are other dietary factors. Sugar is a pro-oxidant of PUFA in humans. That's been shown. DHA seems to be protective. I haven't seen a study showing that it's, we know in the animal models and the big lousy population views, like I mentioned with the Japanese and the Chinese. But what you can't do is run a study and claim it's an RCT or a cohort study and have no control and then claim a conclusion.
So I'm going to again say to this point, okay, so effectively what you've said is that, listen, there's no control. And because there's no control, I'm going to say that there's population level evidence and there's circumstantial evidence that
And there's
when,
mechanistic evidence, more
yes,
tellingly.
listen, I'm not,
Okay.
beyond the point where I would admit that, of course. Like if you look at animal models, I have indeed.
No. Human models.
Yes,
The
even
standard
so,
approach to induce insulin resistance in humans is to inject them with seed oils, and it has
again,
the same effect orally.
I will clarify, and I think it should be clarified, and I again will see this is not my expertise. When
Okay.
you introduce any fat in high doses, like you're under a ketogenic, okay, tell me. I would like to know which so if you have lots of fatty acids in the blood, right? So like you have insulin going up, you then have free fatty acid production, you are going to have insulin resistance. Would you say that, I mean, that this is a
Okay,
biological.
so the evidence base that we have in this area is total parenteral nutrition, right? TPN, which is if you have somebody who can't eat orally, you have to feed them with something. Back in the 50s, they started doing this with a glucose only solution, and they very quickly started getting essential fatty acid deficiencies, right? So they started trying to come up with some fat formula that would, keep these people alive. God bless the doctors for doing this work, and would also not, resolve the fatty acid deficiency. And what they did at the time they started doing this, they thought that fatty acid deficiency was entirely a product of not having enough linoleic acid in the diet. So they used a couple of different formulas. The one that they finally settled upon as the least harmful, because they're all harmful, the least harmful was soybean oil, intralipid, which was invented in 1961. In 1964, they discovered that intralipid causes insulin resistance and hyperglycemia in humans, right? And ever since then, it's been the standard way to do it. Well, the problem with this is that a lot of the people who are on TPN die from liver failure in fairly short order. So they've done a lot of experimenting with the different fatty acids. And at this point, Mark Puder of Boston Children's is the guy who's been spearheading this research. They've found that it's clearly the linoleic acid that's causing the problem, because if you switch them, oh, by the way, I should have mentioned this before. This is one of my best pieces of evidence for why I don't think fish oil is harmful. There was a kid who was on intralipid, this soybean oil infusion, who was getting liver failure, and there are photographs of him online. He was jaundiced, and they were expecting going to need a liver transplant and would probably die in short order. And they took him off the intralipid and they put him on a product called Omegaven, which is a fish oil infusion.
I'm familiar with it.
Okay. And they cured the liver failure. And last I heard, the kid was like 5 or 6 years later on a diet of primarily fish oil in perfect health, right?
It's interesting.
So yes, I should have mentioned that before, folks. By the way,
I don't, frankly, and I think Lane Norton and people who are as polarized as he is probably have a better mechanistic understanding, such that, like, for instance, I cannot explain how intralipid would do this, how it would not. I can maybe tell you that there's differences in oxidation and the replenishment of endogenous antioxidant systems through EPA, et cetera. My question is very targeted, which is that if I randomize a population to a linear increasing dose of arachidonic acid, okay, which I think you would admit is a problem, right? Like you would say that.
Well, I mean, in the animal models, high levels of arachidonic is like super toxic.
Right. So again.
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure that at some point you would wind up with dead people doing that. But
sure. But what I'm saying is up to a gram, and you can see the same thing with linoleic acid. If I give somebody an infusion of linoleic acid, probably up to a gram, well, I suppose it wouldn't be an infusion. If I orally ask you to consume around 1 to 2 grams, linearly, I cannot find any significant difference in a randomized controlled trial, generally speaking, with a linear dose. So I would like to clarify this, because if what you're saying is correct, then you should expect more equals worse. That is the first point. I do not.
No, that's you're making two mistakes there.
Sure.
Right. The
I'm
first
open to it.
mistake, excuse me?
I'm open to it, please.
Okay. The first mistake is that um, wait, you're begging the question, right? You're assuming that you know what the harmful dose is and that you haven't already exceeded it.
Do you think somebody consumes more than 2 grams a day of omega-6?
Omega-6 is the leading source of calories in the United States at this point, right? Seed oils are like the numbers I've seen, seed oils comprise like 21% of our calories, right? But you're begging the question, what's the harmful dose? At what point does it become harmful?
Yeah, I guess again, I understand
Right?
where you're getting at with this. All I'm
Okay.
asking is that if I'm measuring any marker that you and I care about,
So,
and I'm given a dose
but
of arachidonic
that's the
acid, I
second
don't see it.
mistake. The second
Yeah.
mistake is that a lot of nutrients, you know, another paper I found talks about benzene, right? We can both agree that benzene is toxic. Well, it turns out, right? No argument there.
Yes. No
Okay.
argument.
So it
Yeah.
turns out benzene's most toxic at low doses. At
Yes.
higher doses, it starts overwhelming the pathways, and the excess benzene doesn't cause any worse outcome than the first bit of benzene, right? There's
Okay.
threshold effects. We know that there are threshold effects with linoleic acid. This has been shown back in I don't have the study right in front of me, but this has been shown back in the 80s that there are fairly low thresholds for both omega-3s and omega-6 in the body.
So can you indulge me in two other smaller points? NGale Health did a plasma lipidomic study. It was a very, very large genetic study in
Is
which
this
they
in your
evaluated. I don't think so. So I
okay, well,
promise I
we'll
will phrase
follow up
this
on
in
it later. I'd like
I
to put it
promise
in
I
the
will
show
phrase this
notes.
in a way. Yes, and I've also done a thread on this on my own Twitter, but I will phrase this in a way where I will allow every opportunity to respond to this. Point being, very large genetic analysis. They look at the factors underlying mortality, morbidity, etc. So they look at plasma biomarkers of mortality. Omega-6 in serum was protective in terms of plasma biomarkers of mortality. Omega-3
It's
in
associated with better outcomes,
yes, omega-3
not
similarly
protective,
that
associated with better outcomes.
it was sure, but from the standpoint of if you had it in your plasma, you were less
Okay.
likely to die, and that was a linear increasing dose, as was the omega-3. However, when you controlled for the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, the lower that ratio was, you saw the opposite take place. So in other
Okay.
words, you started to see inverse or worse outcomes. So I'm asking
With
again,
a high omega-6, low
yes,
omega-3.
yes. So I'm
Okay.
asking again, I
Well,
think that I think that you're
okay.
flipping this, and there's only one other piece that I will bring up, and I'm happy to move on to a different point of discussion. So if you are saying, listen, we're looking at two sides of the same coin, I'm saying I don't particularly see the evidence. I mean, listen, I could buy it. There's a threshold for omega-6. You know, the systematic reviews aren't capturing it, the meta-analysis isn't capturing it. I'm not entirely sure. But if I say that omega-3 is the problem and you say omega-6 is the problem, don't I have slightly more of a leg to stand on if I look at all of those different pieces of information by saying a deficiency of omega-3 is the problem?
Oh, I would agree that we're deficient in omega-3.
Okay.
And I would definitely agree, as the Alpine study showed, a resolving a deficiency in omega-3 can be beneficial. Is it enough to eliminate the need for reducing omega-6? I don't think that's the case, right?
That's interesting.
But I definitely, it's omega-3 is absolutely a confounder for omega-6. There's no question, right?
That's my problem is I've never been able to escape that confound. The last point I will bring up, and maybe this is beneficial to your listeners, the broad point that I've heard is like, listen, you got the omega-6 fatty acids that has then launched this horrific cascade of health effects. Yes, but so has sugar. If I plot the average level of glucose intake in a population, it's not a questionable thing in meta-analysis. Like, we're not going to sit here and debate a systematic review of what happens when a population consumes more added sugar. It's bad. There's advanced glycation end products, there's insulin resistance. I don't have to guess what happens. It's really bad.
Well,
So
it rots your face. That should be
of
enough.
course. I mean, listen, you get nitro. I mean, it's horrible. So what I'm sort of asking again is, you are a big fan of identifying gaps in statistical understanding, and I respect that as somebody who's interested in that. So why
Yep.
would we not concede that there's this huge question mark that's in the form of added sugar and ultra processing being added into the American diet, both levers, and both, by the way, are coincident with what you're talking about. Manufactured food is omega-6 laden, but it's also very laden added sugar and it's very ultra processed.
Okay. Well, you're a medical student. You're doing research. You answer the question for me. If you
I
want to
don't know,
resolve,
but I'm just
if you
I'm
want
just
to
saying.
resolve a question like that,
Yeah.
how would you do it in an animal model?
Well, what I'm saying is, it's not a matter of answering the question per se. Yes, there would need to
Well,
be a
but
better.
you're asking an excellent question. And I'm asking you, how would you resolve it in an animal model? And
I suppose
even better, has it been done? Right?
you just look at a Bayesian analysis. What I'm saying is, I've just
But
demonstrated.
Bayesian depends on your priors, right? If there's better data, your priors change.
Sure. What I'm saying is, let's look independently at priors. Okay. We just looked at a bunch of different systematic reviews, and your listener can, anybody can, and
They'll
omega
be
six
able
is,
to. I will link them
yes,
all down in the show notes.
omega-6 is going to be a complicated animal. And by the way, I'm not some zealot in either field. For instance, the Annals of Internal Medicine, which is an amazing journal we recently just published with them, had their own Cochrane style review in which they have no idea what to make of omega-6, was not protective for them, and they even said they don't know what to make of saturated fat. It wasn't the demon that a lot of people claim. So just understand, I'm in no camp here in
Okay.
terms of intensity.
No,
All
I
I'm
mean, look,
Yeah,
Jacob, I get it. If
yeah.
Darius Mozaffarian, on the one hand, dean of the School of Nutrition at Tufts University, is saying X, and I'm saying anti-X, then I've got a good argument that I better make.
Well, no, it's so I just want to clarify. I listen, I actually respect it because you've given a lot of information that I think is valid. And frankly, if the listener would like to look at the meta-analysis, it is, Lane Norton, the rest of them are going to claim the epidemiologic studies are clear. They're clear to an extent. It gets muddier when you look around. All I will say is that what is not clear, and this is the point I really want to stress, is that when I increase added sugar, if I randomize somebody to added sugar, if I do anything, every effect that you've just said, hyperinsulinemia, cancer, the incidence of coronary disease, it stops Alzheimer's. It stops becoming a matter of, maybe the meta-analysis doesn't show it. Maybe there's not a good control group. It's very clear with added sugar increasing, I will see horrible physiologic effects on an individual and on a population level. So I
Right.
don't think we'll be
And
able to answer.
okay, two
Yeah,
points I'd like to make here.
yeah,
Um, all those sugar studies are being done in industrial populations who
yeah.
have an industrial Western diet. I prefer to call it an industrial diet just because it gets the whole. I read a hilarious paper once upon a time written by an Indian scientist complaining that it was horrible that people were using the term Western diseases to describe diabetes because it was first discovered in India.
True.
So, and I was like,
So funny.
okay, so,
Yeah,
there's diseases of civilization, diseases of wealth. I try and use the term industrial diet because I think that's really when the whole diet started to
yeah.
massively go sideways, right? Okay. So, industrial diet, they're looking at populations in who are eating all of this stuff. They're eating highly processed diets, right?
Sure.
You know, seed oils were introduced into the population in the late 1800s. Nutritional epidemiology didn't start until the middle of the 20th century, effectively, with Ansel Keys, who gets
Yeah.
lots of credit for that.
Oh yeah.
So again, no control population. Talk to me about populations that aren't eating an industrial diet and compare those to these industrial populations, and you see a very different picture. To your points about linear increases and high linoleic acid levels associating with health, we should discuss the situation of ARDS, which, when I first started talking about this, was an arcane topic that nobody had any interest. And then along came COVID, and 22 million people died of ARDS around the world, right? ARDS is acute respiratory distress syndrome, right? ARDS. It's how COVID kills you. It's how SARS killed you. So they did a lot of research on it back when they were first doing SARS, right? What causes SARS? SARS is induced by leukotoxin diol. Leukotoxin diol is produced through the SEH pathway that Bruce Hammack discovered, right? It is two steps metabolically from linoleic acid in the body, right? It is part of the inflammatory pathway produced by neutrophils to fight off infections. If you have too much, it predisposes to death. They actually did a human RCT with this, looking at patients in an ICU who were on intralipid. And the patients who were on intralipid had 7 times the mortality rate, right, they did really good medicine in this study, but really bad science, because as they realized that they were killing all these people with intralipid, they titrated the intralipid down over the course of the study until nobody was getting intralipid at the end, and the mortality rate was next to nothing, right? So what happens in ARDS to your linoleic acid levels? They go down. High levels predispose you to get it. In the course of the disease, they go down because the linoleic acid is being converted to the thing that's killing you, right? HNE levels, the toxic aldehyde we were discussing before, go up. Leukotoxindiol levels go up. If you take leukotoxindiol, they did this study in Japan, and inject it into a dog, it will die of ARDS in 45 minutes, right? There's no question about causality here, right? High linoleic acid corresponds with longevity because these disease processes are a process of linoleic acid converting into metabolites that cause the disease in the body. ARDS is the clearest example of that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so I think the point is that neither of us are. Yeah,
just looking at linoleic acid in the blood and saying, oh, this is, it correlates with health. Sure, it correlates with health until like ARDS, it kills you. Or
just so I understand,
that's an extreme example, but I think it's illustrative.
Well, let me I really want to get to this. So when you do long-term levels of omega-6, you have the same opinion on this? So like, again, you have multi-decade studies of high levels of, sorry, I said I was going to move topics, but it's just very interesting to me.
I don't know. I threw a big one out there.
Yeah. So if you have a multi-decade study of linoleic acid, which they have, and you see no significant increase in mortality, in fact, you might even see a signal of reduced mortality.
Okay.
So what I'm asking you is, are you saying that the curtain never came and that it's just they were a ticking time bomb waiting for something to go off that never went off?
What percentage of people get lung cancer from smoking?
Oh gosh, I mean it's a minority technically. It's probably 20%. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. This is definitely not my area.
No. You're right. It's 10 to 20%. Yeah. So are we to conclude that smoking is okay because only 10 to 20% of the people? I mean, you're talking about,
you're making a plausible argument. I feel bad.
Wait. Let me just. So you're talking about research that's done in populations who are all eating industrial diets and all have high levels of the chronic diseases that are contemporaneous, we would both agree, with industrial diets, right? So you're looking in a sick population. You're not doing controlled science. It's not controlled science, right? It's the example that I gave before of smoking, right? If smoking causes lung cancer at a pack a week, and you're looking at 2 packs versus 5 packs, you'd conclude that smoking has nothing to do with lung cancer because your incidence is the same in both levels. But obviously that's not valid.
Yeah, I don't think you'll ever see a study that says if I randomize somebody to more versus less cigarettes, that on average, I would see somebody with a higher cigarette intake living longer. That is what is striking to me. That would be the example.
I agree. But I mean, Mozaffarian's done studies showing a linear relationship between linoleic acid consumption and diabetes until he adjusted it by body weight. Listen, then the effect went away. How convenient.
I hope we see it, Tugger. I really would like to see it. I appreciate, thank you for engaging with it, because I think that ultimately the listener is going to figure out, or whoever is going to figure out what the situation is, whether it's an omega-3 or omega-6 problem, or whether it's neither and it's, an evil sugar.
Right. So to your point, though, the research that we need to be doing is the only research that you can do when looking at something that's ubiquitous is take it away.
Right? No, I mean, listen.
There have been a couple of studies that have taken it away and have shown good effects.
I can see that anything that increases omega-3, even if indirectly, is probably doing something beneficial. So that is an interesting discussion. But out of curiosity, do you want me to get into to cocoa, or is that out of the bounds?
Oh my God, we got to stop on an up note.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Tell us about dark chocolate.
Yeah, so that's the other type of research we do. Maybe Tucker will have me on to do vitamin D.
By the way, I want to lead this by saying when I fixed my diet initially,
Yeah.
my two primary, I've been low sugar since I was 18 or 19 because I had so many dental problems when I was a
No
kid.
wonder you're so yeah. No wonder you're so healthy, man.
Well, that's the thing. I got fat and sick anyway, even though I was on a low sugar diet for decades. Um, I didn't get any more cavities though, so that absolutely worked. And I can't even remember the guy's name, but I give full credit to that dentist for saying to me, if you don't want to come see me anymore, don't eat sugar. And I was like,
Yeah.
really? That's it? I can do that. And sure enough, anyway, what was I saying? So when I fixed my diet, my two go-to snacks were macadamia nuts and 85 or 90% chocolate. Above 90%, it starts getting bitter. A little bit of sugar is good, right? So lead us into this. Tell us about dark chocolate, and I hope I'm not crying by the end of this.
No, no, no. And I apologize to your listener. I think I'm going to be one of the more irritatingly dense people that you've ever talked to. So I will make this in distilled principles. So big finding comes out over the course of years. Consumer Reports and ConsumerLab.com say, oh my God, if I test dark chocolates, there's really high levels of metal. Why is this happening?
Right.
Is this biologically significant? So that is this kind of general understanding of this.
And
okay.
Can I just interject one thing in here for people to understand? There's years ago, before I got interested in any of this nutrition stuff, I looked into the question of mercury in fish, right?
Yep.
Mercury is obviously a problem. It's very toxic. I grew up living near Danbury, Connecticut, which used to be the hat capital of the world, where they had what they called the Danbury Shakes, which was neurological damage from mercury, right? Mercury is a bad thing. The Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland was because of mercury exposure in the hat making industry. So that's the heavy metal problem. In fish, which have high levels of mercury, it turns out selenium is protective against mercury toxicity. So most of the time, you don't really have to worry about mercury toxicity when you're eating fish, unless it's like there's been a industrial spill of mercury or something in the neighborhood. So yeah, that's kind of where he's getting with this, is the dark chocolate story of heavy metals.
Yes. And to be clear, certain kinds of fish you don't recommend eating consistently, like, tuna, larger fish, sharks, etc.
Swordfish. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I will not get into this now. If people are curious, I'm happy to sort of explain dosages and particular kinds of fish, etc. But I will save that for a different time. Point being, when we're talking about oh, by the way, if anybody's curious, I will always plug Safe Catch for your listeners. So I'm not sure if they're aware of it, but that's the lowest mercury tuna. I have no affiliation with them.
Oh, they test it?
Every single tuna is tested for mercury and a variety of other heavy metals in testing. Go to consumerlab.com if you want to see it. Amazing product. Problem is they don't have as much omega, but great product.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So anyways, to the point that we were talking about, there's this whole controversy is that, if I look at dark chocolate, I see higher levels of heavy metal. When we talk about heavy metal, we're not talking about anything but cadmium and lead. Arsenic, as a general rule, is now low in dark chocolate, so it's a matter of cadmium and lead. Okay.
Oh goody.
Yeah. So it's this interesting thing where there's then this question of, okay, I've identified that there's cadmium and lead. Tucker, do you care to know, or do you think it's interesting to know where it comes from? Because if not, I could just skip into what it means, like why there's cadmium or lead in chocolate.
Well, I'm guessing, yeah, you should mention that. I mean, I'm guessing I know some plants preferentially absorb heavy metals from the soils. I presume it's something like that.
Yeah. So heavy metals are everywhere. So I just want to make this clear to your listeners so that, everybody's not running around, having a panic attack about eating chocolate. There's heavy metal in literally everything that you're eating. Spinach, extremely high levels of heavy metals, aluminum, etc. I mean, plants are just natural binders. They chelate it. They have very special relationships with metals. Metals in the human body are an area that is above my intellectual pay grade. It is a lot of stuff going on there. Okay. Point. By the way, just for the record, people who eat a lot more plants have lower levels of heavy metal, so it's not as clear as, just there's heavy metal content.
Oh, that's interesting. So we do have
Yes.
ways of clearing it.
Oh, yes. Oh, I mean, you have phytosterol. There are things that bind to it in a plant. The point being is,
Okay.
why is it in the chocolate? So the original thought is that it's in the cacao bean, and that when you're harvesting the cacao plant, you're just getting a ton of heavy metal. There was a group called As You Sow. I recommend going to As You Sow. I think it is .org, and they actually sued a lot of the big chocolate companies because in their testing of dark chocolate, they were finding a lot of heavy metal, lead and cadmium. And they said, well, that's not right. That doesn't make any sense. And when they investigated, what they found was that, and I really encourage you to read the report. Maybe I'll link it for you because it's like about an 80-page document. Don't read all 80 pages, but a few of the reports do this really good job of explaining that a lot of it is coming from post-processing. So when you're down in South America,
Okay.
and you're down in any of these places when your cacao beans are sourced, understand that it is not a well-regulated factory half the time like you see, let's just say in the US or some other country. I mean, it is, they're burning tires next to the chocolate. There's industrial plants,
Well,
industrialization.
I've seen coffee farms where they've got like, coffee beans laid out lying on these big flat things of metal
Yeah,
so they can dry in the sun. I think cocoa beans go through a
exactly the
similar
same.
process.
Exactly the same. They have to dry, and accordingly, they're exposed to all sorts of things in the atmosphere. And of course, heavy metal is everywhere. Industrialization led to a lot of heavy metal contamination of different soils, and that's a whole other conversation. Suffice to say, a lot of it seems to be post-processing contamination. Okay, and so
Okay, well,
that's
that's worse, I would say.
it is. It is worse, and that's worse precisely because it's not. I mean, whether or not it's originally grown in it's a complicated question. But the point being is that it doesn't have to be there, right? In a lot of cases, the levels that you see do not have to exist as such, and so post processing is a real serious area now when it comes to dark chocolate. Is where are you sourcing it, and what is the quality of it, et cetera. And there's really no reliable way to do that. So what consumerlab.com and Consumer Reports do when they test it is just kind of report the heavy metals, and they typically report the levels as they pertain to California Prop 65. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with that. CA Prop 65 is basically this big list of levels that you have to adhere to and
Is that why we
warning.
get all those terrifying warnings on all of our
Yes,
products nowadays?
you're absolutely correct. California says if you want to do business with us, you have to comply by our standards. So there's this giant list of things and different levels. And so if you're in violation of that, you will get sued real bad if you do not put, hey, this may cause cancer and that giant
According to
disclaimer.
California Prop
Yes,
65, this
yes,
product contains blah, blah, blah
yes,
that
yes.
might kill you in the next 5 or 6 minutes.
Yes, and so it's kind of annoying because acrylamide's on it. Acrylamide's in coffee, so half the time when you drink coffee, you're like, "What's going on here?" It's
Right.
it's a whole thing. How California Prop 65 is derived, I will not get into. The point being, it's a very, very conservative estimate of how much metal you should have when you test that dark chocolate. What ConsumerLab.com used, I think they still use it. I have to double check, but it's the Prop 65 limits. For lead, that is 0.5 micrograms per day. For cadmium, that is 4.1 micrograms per day. Why do I say these things? I say these things because what I'm about to talk about directly hinges on those levels. Okay, that to understand what I'm saying, you have to understand those levels. So we understand what a Prop 65 limit, and we agree that it's one of the most conservative limits that have ever been established for pretty much anything. But this is a very
For
conservative.
exposures, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
for exposures. Yeah, I should be more specific for food, especially. And by the way, I'm a big fan of it. I'm not dismissing it. I think more states should adopt it for various reasons. Um, the labeling, I'm not even going to comment on because I don't have the qualifications to. Point being, when you're the FDA or you're the CDC and you're trying to determine what level of lead or what level of cadmium is bad, what you do is you look at a large cohort. Usually that's the NHANES. NHANES is a really, really big population cohort in which they sample a lot of crazy things, metals, blood work,
Yep.
food. It's a very robust cohort. I'm sure you could probably explain it in detail if you'd like, Tucker.
No, yeah. Anybody who
Yeah.
studies nutrition for any length of time is going to come across the NHANES database.
Yes. Yes. And I would refer to Dr. Frame, who's an expert on these things. She's my PI also. She's amazing. Really brilliant. And as I said, if you ever want to have one of us back for vitamin D, you'd be in for a real treat because that's what we do. But point being,
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, we're not going to have enough time to get into
yeah,
that
yeah,
today,
we
so
probably
we'll
won't. But at
definitely
some
have to
point,
hit
I'd
that
love to
one.
talk to you in depth about vitamin D. That's another fun thing.
Okay, because you did a fascinating paper. Let me just throw this out on
Yeah.
vitamin D, diabetes, and autoimmune
Yeah, yeah, it
which
was a great band.
was, you know, one of my little pet topics that was okay. Some other time. Keep
Yeah,
going.
yeah, yeah. There'll be a tease. There'll be a tease.
You
Don't worry.
haven't completely ruined chocolate for us yet, so
No,
keep
no, no. I'm
going.
going to ruin the chocolate. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, it's not going to be ruined. So, point being, you have to derive a lead level. So that lead level is then going to be from a population percentile peak in that population. So I just said a lot of ridiculous words. In
Okay.
other words, the
No, so
blood.
you're looking at the exposure in the population already, and you're
Yes,
saying,
yes.
okay, everybody has this much lead, so we're not going to worry about that's going to be the level that we're worried about.
Yes, so the big magic number is the 97.5th percentile, or the blood level reference value for lead. Okay, so what we say is this is the 97.5th percentile. I mean, it's just really above 95. This is the level that we think is a level that everybody should be under. What's important about that is that's a moving target that has actually become more and more conservative over time.
Well,
Okay.
I would imagine as we got rid of lead in gasoline, that it's been, and in paint, that it's been going down over time.
Yes. And so that actually corresponds to a blood lead level. That blood lead level is the 97.5th percentile, 98th percentile, whatever. And that's about,
Right.
I think it's 0.35 nanogram, but I don't want to quote that. But
Okay.
I would like to be clear, that is the blood lead level. Okay. So you have a blood lead level, you know where that's derived from, and you then have to estimate an intake. The intake for that is 22 micrograms per day for a child, I think it's under 7, of lead, or 88 micrograms for a pregnant female. Okay. So, and you say, well, gosh, that's a lot of lead. No one's really going to hit that. And so, what the FDA does is they apply this uncertainty factor of 10, and that then brings it down to 2.2 microgram per day for children under 7 and 8.8 microgram a day for females, that special population of
Which is what I mentioned before. They come up with a level of
yes.
what they think is going to be a problem, and then they cut it way down below that level. That doesn't mean that if you're twice that lower level that you're actually going to have a problem.
Yes, exactly. So let's be clear. The IRL is the interim reference level that is designated, that is then given a particular microgram per day allowance. That allowance is 2.2 microgram or 8.8 microgram, depending on what part of the population you're at for lead. Contrast that with 0.5 microgram a day for the California Prop 65 limit. Okay, I just want to compare those two. So in other
Right.
words, the CA Prop 65 is a lot more conservative for various reasons. Okay. Now, why do I bring any of this up? Well, when you test a lot of the dark chocolate, and we're going to explore this in detail, hopefully, if it ends up being peer reviewed properly. But a lot of chocolate, for better or worse, is going to exceed either lead or cadmium levels. So either that 4.1 microgram a day stipulation or that 0.5 micrograms a day stipulation for lead. And so the question is, like, does any of that matter? For lead, any value greater than 0 in the blood is associated with a drop in cognition. I think it's about 0.5 is a 0.5 microgram
Right.
or nanogram is associated with a 1 point drop. Point being, you don't want to have any real blood lead level of lead if you can avoid it. And so what you try to do is maximize your risk of you minimize your risk of exposure. So in hard numbers, what you find is that most chocolate on average falls below even CA Prop 65 levels for lead and cadmium. Okay, so that falls below that 0.5 microgram a day for lead and 4.1 microgram a day for cadmium. But I say this with a big but. There are a lot of outliers, and I don't say like one or two. I'm saying there are many, many outliers that vastly exceed those standards. So for cadmium, you could get up to 14.1 to 15 micrograms per serving. So this is not your total diet. This is per serving of dark
One
chocolate.
bar of chocolate.
No, not one bar of chocolate. One serving of that chocolate. So
One
that could
piece of that
yes,
bar of
yeah. So that could
chocolate.
even be a quarter of a bar of chocolate. Okay, same
Yikes.
thing that you will find with lead. Okay, and so that opens up a lot of doors, because what I've just said is that maybe the average is fine, but certain products, by the way, especially those that have all the certifications that everybody's obsessed with, tend to feature higher rates of cadmium. Okay, so even if you're the savvy consumer that's like, I only buy organic tilth, X product, you're still being exposed.
You're out of luck.
Yeah, exactly. You're still being exposed to a lot of different things. So what we've tried to, expose or not expose, or what we've tried to illustrate is that there's a good percentage of products on the market that are going to exceed a lot of these thresholds that we care about because lead and cadmium is toxic to the body. We didn't really cover why cadmium is bad. Suffice to say, a lot of cardiotoxicity, a lot of carcinogenicity, a lot of teratogenicity, and just generally speaking, not a great thing to have in the body for various reasons. I could get into specifics. I will spare the listener because I'm
Those
sure
are
it's
all bad enough words.
yeah, listen, it's already bad enough at this point. Okay,
Right.
so the main part of dark chocolate that I will mention is this, which is that I don't really know why a chocolate company or anybody writ large is allowed to give us allowed to give you heavy metal in your chocolate, especially that exceeds certain parameters. Okay, but it's the reality of it. It's sort of what we live with. And so the question is,
can I ask you just one quick question here?
yeah.
Are the bigger companies like a Nestle, say, or a Mars gonna have more internal controls around this and produce a better product?
Yeah. So,
I mean, I don't know if you guys have gone down the same route that you've
no.
gone down with
They
the
test
fish
individual
oil.
brands. So I
Yeah.
will again plug what we do at consumerlab.com. We test all the chocolates, a good percentage. I forget the number, but it's a lot.
Okay.
And essentially, there are certain brands that are good. Ghirardelli is great. So that is one that
Okay.
you tend to find is just a very, very clean producer of dark chocolate. And the other thing is that as you get darker and darker, there's more metal, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But like that's
One
just a
example, I guess, where more sugar is a good thing.
yeah, right. Well, no, it's actually not. Like the dark chocolate is still healthier for a variety of reasons. You get more cacao, you have better biological significance associated with it, generally speaking. But I just want to like put a footnote in there. The other thing that I would like to earmark is, I've said all these bad things that there are certain chocolates that exist in the world that are just, going to expose you to high levels of cadmium per se. But on average, it's not a problem. And at this point, there is no reason for anyone to curtail their dark chocolate. This is just an academic conversation of, listen, if you're going to be eating dark chocolate, it might be beneficial to know which one is exposing you to high levels of heavy metal. Does that make sense?
But let me ask you, right, okay, well, that sounds reasonable, but let me ask you a
Yeah.
question. I mean, if you're on a ketogenic diet and you're eating a lot of fat every day, and the fatty acid profile of cocoa is very beneficial in a lot of ways.
Oh yes, lots of stearic
it's got a
acid.
lot of saturated fat in it, but it's
Yeah.
got good saturated fats in it. So
Yes.
I mean, I would kind of conclude that if you're doing this, you would be more inclined to be pursuing the lower heavy metal brands rather than the higher heavy metal brands.
Yeah. So one of the funniest things was I think you had a conversation with Nick, the real Nick that we just discussed, in which he
The real
posted
Nick, yes.
yeah, in which I'm just joking. I'm sure they're both great guys, but he posted a photo of his dark chocolate, and I screenshotted our report on dark chocolate that showed it had almost, I think, over 12 micrograms of cadmium per serving. In the lower cacao version of what he had. And so it's unclear because batch to batch, there's variation in heavy metals. But to your point, I thought it was so funny that this person who ostensibly, I'm sure, takes amazing care of themselves, like is keto, they do all these things, and yet they're consuming this product that may or may not be laden with metals. And so that's the consumer that I care about, is the consumer that is by all remarks really trying to maintain a healthy diet and yet is unnecessarily exposing themselves to a product that may or may not be generating some level of toxicity.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
That is definitely really interesting. So,
Yeah, and so I
okay,
just want to
so
reiterate that's not a reason to stop consuming dark chocolate. And by the way, if you're concerned, it also comes in pills that don't have any heavy metal whatsoever. If you want the polyphenol or the cocoa or whatever else, but
what's the point of that? I mean, it's
I
like,
know.
what I was saying with the fermented cod liver oil, you want
Yeah.
it on your tongue, and that's the whole
Oh
joy
man,
of this stuff.
gosh, yes,
I'm not taking chocolate pills.
yeah.
What's the fun in that?
Anyways, listen, I hope the consumer isn't scared. If they want to look at the list, Consumer Report, Consumer Lab, do one of the two. You'll find a really big list of stuff that's safe. This is just more of an academic matter of significant interest, which is the market struggles with this, and that if you go to a store, it's kind of a crapshoot as to where the metal's coming from. I eat a lot of dark chocolate. I'm not sitting here saying I don't. I do. I like it. I'm sure you do too.
Yeah.
It's just something to be mindful of on a general level, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a little unclear on what the takeaway from this is that except
So
that
the takeaway
thumbs
is
up
that
to Girardelli, which is
no
one of my
no
favorites. Thank
so
heavens.
the takeaway that I would get at, because I understand that it doesn't seem like there's much of a takeaway, is one, an awareness that there's going to be heavy metal in chocolate that you're consuming, especially dark chocolate, and two, that on average it's probably not that big of a deal. Okay.
Okay.
But that there are notable outliers, and as to what to do about those outliers is a really interesting public health question. Like, should somebody be saying, hey, these outliers cannot exist in a market, and why is the consumer not being told that they could be exposed to this? It's a good
Now,
question.
would they
Yeah.
have to have a Prop 65 label on them?
Oh man, you have preemptively asked a question that I didn't want you to ask. I don't know the answer to that, and I think that's why
Okay.
there's a lot of lawsuits. Is that I don't know. I really, really don't know. And to me, it strikes me as obvious that if you're engaged in a higher degree of cadmium than what the limit allows, that you should post it. But I'm not an expert on that. I'd probably talk to a health lawyer.
Okay, fine. So the last question I want to ask you, this has been a great conversation, I think. Thank you for all of it. It's been very educational. You're going to medical school, you want to be a doctor. How in blazes did you get into the consumer labs stuff and that whole aspect of the food nutrition thing? Because I mean, it's a really interesting area. I mean, it's really, I've talked about olive oil a lot, that 80% of the olive oil market is fraudulent. Zero Acre Farms, the
Yeah.
company that I consult with, did a Future Fat Summit a couple of years ago, and they had the lady who's done the research at UC Davis on talking about that market. She did the same research for the avocado oil market. I know the honey market is supposedly like 90%
Yeah.
fraudulent Chinese honey that they filter the pollen out of, which is against the law, and yet nobody's doing anything about it. I think the FDA arrested one guy who, they found one company that like came down on a pile of bricks, and everybody else in the market skirted, which
Yeah.
I think is really upsetting. I mean, I think the whole topic of, well, if the FDA isn't watching it, and in the olive oil industry has come up and said, okay, we're going to have a certification program. It's voluntary, but they do give you a list of people who pay for the certification, which is what I go when I go to the store and buy olive oil, I go off that list. So I
Yeah.
think it's really helpful for people to have stuff like this. How did you get into this?
Yeah. By the way, for again, we also test olive oil. So if anybody's ever curious, we have all the tests for all these different things. So that's what I rely on. And so I was actually using consumerlabs.com for a long time personally. And I had done clinical research up to that point in mostly skin cancer. So that was my background. I really like melanoma. Um, and like
Researching it anyway.
yeah. Well, I like researching it, and I like lots of things about melanoma. About like it's just a fascinating entity. Yeah. So, anyways, as to how I got into this, I was super interested in melanoma. I was doing clinical research, and I was using consumerlabs.com for a long time, and I really really enjoyed their work. And I had also up to this point been really curious about fish oils, and specifically the oxidation of fish oils, because I was really conflicted by the epidemiologic data we saw earlier, where you have more omega-3 in the blood, it's good. You don't see that effect translate when you consume the supplements half the time. And so, it was a fantasy of mine that you're basically consuming oxidized oils, aldehydes especially. Those are doing damage. There's saturated fat in lower quality supplements that's not really filtered out. And basically, it's just a bad market. So I reached out to them with that issue, and I connected with Mark Anderson, who's their VP of research. And I said, listen, I really would like to do a paper on this. I still do clinical research at an institute here. And, I was wondering if we could collaborate. And that's sort of how I got involved doing clinical research or consumer type research with them. And that's,
Well, that's great. And they were open to that, obviously, because you're doing
they
it.
really were. They really were. Todd Cooperman, Dr. Todd Cooperman and Dr. Anderson, they're amazing people. Their entire staff is incredible. So really, it's a joy to be able to work on consumer products. As to why I care about any of this, the medical field has this very weird relationship with nutrition. And like,
That's a good way to put it.
yeah, where like, they'll kind of just tell you what an RDA is, and will say like, yeah, don't eat a lot of sugar, and then beyond that, they don't understand a lot sometimes, and so
Well, most physicians get no training by
well, no,
the
no,
end.
you peg that. You get literally one week and probably less. You probably get two classes, on human nutrition, or like three classes, and you
Right.
don't really understand what any of it means. And so your patients will come to you and say, I'm on a keto diet. Doctor says, by the way, I know you have complicated opinions about keto. I have very complicated opinions about keto, so I will not belabor that point. But they'll say I'm on keto. Doctor will say, "Oh my God, like
Yeah.
you
Ketoacidosis.
yeah, so stop it right, and it'll be this whole thing. And so it was sad to me. And so clinical nutrition is still one of just the most fascinating things to me, because food fundamentally is a treatment. And so if
Right.
you start changing somebody's diet and you start altering supplementation, and I don't really believe in supplementation in the general sense of the word, but let's say add in omega-3 or something like
Well, there
that.
are certainly circumstances where it's a good idea. I mean, especially if you're, talking about overt deficiency,
Oh yes,
then
yeah. I'm not
by
saying
all
that, but I'm saying
means, yeah,
targeted. Yeah,
yeah,
I'm saying targeted supplementation, not
yeah,
like, the guy who says, "Listen, I'm going to do full stack with palmetto or something," and has no idea what's going on. Like that
right.
doesn't mean anything. But yeah, like listen, if you're taking magnesium, modern diets are heavily deficient in magnesium. Like I'm there with you, buddy. Like it's probably a good thing for a variety of reasons. So I'm not a dogmatic. The large point I'm making, besides being a stalwart of various things, is that um, I really do feel like nutrition in the medical field should be front and center. And there's a lot of really wonderful programs at GW that are exploring health nutrition in clinical medicine. And I think those are great. And so I've always had a fascination with nutrition. And I imagine your listeners do too, as do you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know how much you know about my backstory, but I had all sorts of health problems that were
Yeah.
all the product of, I will call it malnutrition, because it's
Yeah.
basically what malnutrition is. And, you know, it was all my own reading and trial and error that enabled me to figure all those things out and cure them. And it would have been nice if, for instance, the gastroenterologist I saw before I had a colon resection had said,
Oh,
"Oh, you have chronic diarrhea. Have you ever tried going on a wheat-free diet?"
well, and that's the thing, is that so many of these conditions, they have really powerful links to diet and specific aspects of the diet. And
Right.
it's just one of those unfortunate realities that if you go to your doctor or you go to the NP or whoever you're seeing and you say, hey, I can I drink like fermented milk, or like, it'll be like I don't know, like who knows? Go find out yourself. And like that
Right.
is, yeah, that's just, or worse, there will be dogmatic opinions about it. Like, what are you talking about? You're taking omega-3. That's horrible. Or like,
Right.
you're going to
Right.
get an arrhythmia, so that's the intersection, or like the aspect of that field that I really love. I appreciate you asking about it. I usually, the background is kind of uninteresting to the end listener, but it's something that
Well,
I
I'm
still
always, I got into this in such a ridiculous sort of way, in my
yeah.
own opinion, that I'm always curious how other people get into it. There's usually a some kind of interesting intellectual journey behind it. I mean, I'm looking forward, there seems to be, to me, a lot more younger physicians who are a lot more interested in nutrition and the effects it can have on the body.
Yeah.
I think that's probably largely a function of how many sick people there are around them growing up nowadays, where they're like, I mean, there's more opportunities for people to have dramatic improvements in health when everybody's sick because of what's effectively malnutrition in this country. So,
Yeah.
whereas when our grandparents were growing up and everybody was generally healthy, it wasn't
Yeah.
as obvious that it was such a big issue, except for, again, overt malnutrition,
Yeah.
nutrient
Well, and that's the
deficiencies.
thing. So much of modern diets have just been, and I didn't mean to cut you off, just so poor that I think there's going to be a lot of people who have a lot of nutritional problems at best that are going to need to seek further treatment just because there's no really good answer to it. So it's great that, you know, people like you can kind of help steer people in the direction of evidence-based medicine. But yeah, that's sort of the goal.
Yep. Okay. Great. This is a fantastic conversation, Jacob. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me on, Tucker. As I said, anytime anybody would like to discuss in so much horrible detail vitamin D or other oxidation products, I'm all ears, man.
Well, the whole, you know, as we got into a little bit on X, I guess I'm going to have to get used to saying that.
Yeah, I'm not used to it either. I mean, that's
Yeah,
just
you
above
know,
my
the
pay.
topic of these chronic diseases, I've really come to the conclusion that they're all basically autoimmune at base. And, you know, you mentioned the macrophage infiltration, and you see that in all of these conditions. And I think, you know, you introduced me to a few papers that I hadn't seen on that topic in diabetes. And I think that's, you know, going to help elucidate more intelligent ways to treat these things than just take a pill.
Yeah, one would hope. But yeah, of
Yeah,
course. Thanks again for having me. Appreciate it.
great.
Pleasure. Do you take omega-3 out of curiosity?
You know, that's interesting. That was the first thing I did. And the first thing I did in fixing my diet was start taking omega-3 supplements. And that was after I read about the English prison
Yeah.
experiment. Um,
English prison?
so they started giving omega-3 supplements to people with aggressive tendencies in a prison. They're easy to find
Smooth
there.
out.
and
Yeah.
they saw a huge improvement in their behavior.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. And, you know, I was like, I like fish, but I don't eat a lot of it. So I started taking the supplements. I never noticed any difference.
Mm.
And, you know, something you alluded to, that lowering omega-6 can increase omega-3.
Yeah.
Oh, I guess I mentioned that in the response to Rhonda.
Yeah.
When I cut seed oils out of my diet, a couple of the guys that I worked with commented on how much easier I was to work with, and how much more even tempered I was, and how I used to fly into these rages and I didn't do it anymore. And I was like, oh my God, that's so embarrassing.
That's so funny.
Right.
Yeah, I
I
mean, listen,
mean,
it
a
could
good
be.
thing
Yeah.
to find out about yourself, but